Welcome to Session 1 of Jerusalem Time, a 7-part exploration of time in Jerusalem and beyond at the time of Corona. This symposium is taking place under the umbrella of Jerusalem Tolerance's Yom Yerushalmim, promoting diversity in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day, which began tonight, and every day. In this session, Clocking In, I will interview Julian Barnett about telling the time in some of the holy cities' closed religious sects. I'm Diana Lipton, the convener of this symposium. I moved to Jerusalem in 2011 after 5 years teaching at King's College London and 9 years at Newnham College, Cambridge. I'm now a teaching fellow in the Department of Biblical Studies at Tel Aviv University. I've written, co-authored and edited volumes on subjects including dreams in Genesis, universalism and particularism at Sodom and Gomorrah, lamentations in popular culture, and most recently, what the Torah is talking about when it's talking about food. Now I'm working on a book on the Bible and climate change. I have 2 sons, Jacob and Jonah. Jacob is producing this Zoom event. Julian Barnett was educated at Carmel College, England's Jewish Eton. He spent the past 32 years teaching history in his hometown of Leicester, at the Anglican School in Jerusalem, and now at South Bank International School in central London. Julian has a deep fascination with obscure sects of Jewish, Christian, and the Muslim worlds, and they've taken him all over Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. He's a serious collector of religious objects, some of which you can see behind him in his Bloomsbury flat. Julian knows parts of London, Cairo, Jerusalem, and other Middle Eastern cities that few insiders, let alone outsiders, ever reach. And if you enjoy this, look out for Julian's own YouTube channel coming very soon. So, one more thing, in this presentation and 2 others, which I'll alert you to as they come up, there will be slides. So keep your Zoom windows open so you'll be able to see the slide share. So Julian, my first question for you is, why is time more complicated in Jerusalem than in most other cities?
Good evening, Dana, and good evening to everybody. I think that is a fascinating question, and I think there's 2 reasons that immediately come to mind. One is, and this is a powerful statement I'm going to make here, Jerusalem as a city is a concept, and there are very, very few cities, I would argue, on this planet that are concepts. It revolves around an idea. London, Paris, New York, great cities of the world, but are they really concepts? I think Jerusalem is. And absolutely crucial as a lubricant to make that concept work, to turn that concept from an idea into a practical way of living, is time. Time by clocks, time by history, time by the way people look at things and understand things. I think there's a second reason, and that is much more practical. It is the fact that essential Jerusalem, for those that have been, they'll know this, for those that haven't, they might not. Essential Jerusalem, and what I mean by that is the old city, what's known as the Holy Basin, is minute. It's absolutely minute. Here you have, roundabout in all my years of gathering information about the sects within the city, you have roundabout 230 at my last count, Jewish sects or organizations within the city, 106 Islamic, 116 Christian. So you have a multiplicity of hundreds of sects living within sometimes meters of each other. And therefore the potential for clashing and the potential for dispute is absolutely immense. So one of the mechanisms that is and always was and is used to this day in order to manage that, I'm not saying to turn it into a city into love, but into a city that works in a practical way, is that use of time and clocks. And it is a remarkable, successful way of doing it. We shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. We shouldn't say that this is a city that is at peace with itself and where peace reigns supreme. But more than any other city in the world, Jerusalem is a city that could be clashing on religious grounds with sectarian killings day in, day out. And as a rule, that doesn't happen. And one essential reason for that is time.
Thank you. So how are all these different calendars and time schedules visible or audible to outsiders in Jerusalem?
So now I'm going to come to some pictures, and I think that's the best way of explaining this. The things that come to mind if we're looking at Christian places of worship are, of course, bells. And bells play a really important part in Christian Jerusalem itself, but they play a much bigger part than bells in other parts of the world. You have bells to signal pilgrims coming. You have bells to signal services coming, but you also have bells to signal the territory of different Christian sects. This picture here is obviously Greek Orthodox. There's the Greek flag there. This is a Greek Orthodox church within the Greek Patriarchate. And as well as bells in Christian Jerusalem that mark the passage of time, you also have ceremonies. You could mark like an absolute clock what happens every Friday afternoon, the next ceremony that comes, and that is the procession of the cross to relive the last moments of Jesus going from his trial to his crucifixion and his burial. So as well as bells in the Christian community, and I'll come back to that later on, you also have ceremonies that play a really, really important part in that. And then let's turn to the Islamic world. In the Islamic world within Jerusalem, you have the call to prayer. It's the most obvious one. 5 times a day, and particularly resonant at the moment during Ramadan from one of the most famous muezzin in Jerusalem, which is the minaret of the Mosque of Omar. Again, I'll mention that in relation to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre a little later. But the cycle of life is really important, and it's very, very obvious what the Islamic cycle of life is. We're coming up at the moment to the end of Ramadan. Ramadan is due to end this Saturday evening, and Ramadan lights and Ramadan fairs and all types of things involved with that. It's a very, very visual and audible way to understanding what is going on in the city. But the Jewish life in the city is perhaps less audible. Because the Jewish life in the city doesn't have bells and doesn't have public calls to prayer. Perhaps it's because it doesn't need to, because the Jews are in the main in control of the city. But here you have a very good example, the Machne Yehuda market in Jerusalem before the Sabbath, Shabbat, absolutely packed out people shopping. And the foods for sale in that are seasonal foods. For example, chalot, and particularly those round chalot, the breads for the Sabbath, for Shabbat. So, although the Jewish life doesn't seem to absolutely hit you in the face from the point of view of keeping to time and so on, it is very much there. And of course, let's not forget the power of silence, because once a week is Shabbat. And the Jewish year is peppered with festivals. And for those that have been in Jerusalem, the silence that just descends upon the western part of Jerusalem when Shabbat arrives is a deafening silence. It's a striking silence. And it couldn't be a more sort of powerful evocation of that cycle, of that time that is going on in order to ensure that the weeks and the months and the years tick past.
So does time have an active role to play in helping people to keep peace between all these different religious groups in Jerusalem, do you think?
There is the question. There is the question. The keeping of peace, particularly on a day like this, Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day. Let me start off with a photo that is perhaps not the most obvious one you would think, and I'll explain why I'm showing this. This is Damascus Gate, English name. Hebrew Shar Shechem, the gate to Shechem, biblical Nablus, or biblical Shechem, now Nablus. It's also known in Arabic as Bab al-Amud, the gate of the column, because in Roman times, the Hadrianic period, a huge column stood there. Perhaps with Hadrian on top, perhaps not. Why do I start with this in answer to your question? I start with this because, let's think, Londoners know and love Trafalgar Square. Everybody knows it as Trafalgar Square to commemorate the Battle of Trafalgar, October 1805. New Yorkers know and love Times Square, no pun intended. These two squares are not disputed in names. Every New Yorker knows it as Times Square. Nobody would say, well, this isn't Times Square to me. This isn't Trafalgar Square. I call it by a different name. This just wouldn't happen in London or in New York. These are the squares that they're known by. But here we have a similarly iconic meeting place in Jerusalem that's been there for 2,000 years. And it is in dispute. The people call it by 3 different names. And incidentally, every single one of the 7 working gates around the walls of the old city are called by an English, an Arabic, and a Hebrew name. Now, is this only just names? I would say it's not. I would say to you that in this sense, time is not just clocks. I think the Jerusalem definition of time is far more radical. Time is the passage of time. The whole definition of time in Jerusalem is completely different. It's not just the cycle of clocks. It's not just a ticking hand going round a clock. It is the whole cycle of existence over the last 10, 20, 100, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years. And this example of Damascus Gate seen through the lenses of different people in different ways. They're seeing their identity through the passage of time. They're seeing the history of the passage of time, and that influences the way they behave now and the way they see Jerusalem now. This is a classic example of that. Let's now go through Damascus Gate. And we have an aerial view here of, in Arabic, the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, in English, the Temple Mount. Third holiest site in Islam, third holiest city in Islam after Mecca and Medina. Only Jerusalem is known in Islamic tradition as Al-Quds, the holy. Only Jerusalem is known by that. Now let's look closely at this picture. There is Al-Aqsa Mosque, just to the south, where the cursor is moving for you. And just to the north of that is the Dome of the Rock, the shrine built over the rock by Islamic and Jewish tradition, where many, many key events happened. And then just there to the west, you can see the large open space, the plaza, in what's now called the Western Wall Plaza. And then if we go up a little bit to those trees near the top, that's the beginning of the squares that lead to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The power of this picture is incredible. Within one fell swoop, within one sight of the eye there, you can see these three holy sites for the three monotheistic faiths. And time dominates how these three faiths interact on a picture like this. Jews can go up to the Temple Mount at certain times and have to come down at certain times, 7:30 in the morning till 10 in the morning, 1:30 to 2:30 in the afternoon. The Christians are dominated by the use of bells, and we'll come back to that later. And time is essential to make sure that this system operates correctly. Let's go a little closer now into this set of pictures. There you have the steps up to the 28 El Barak steps, traditionally where Muhammad ascended to heaven. And above those steps, you have the arches from the Mamluk period. And look above those arches and you'll see 28 holes. Remember that number, 28 steps and 28 holes. And if we move on, we see if we got to the top of those steps, you could look over and you would see two minarets on either side of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. One taller minaret there of the Mosque of Omar, and one smaller one there, the Hanka Mosque, the Mosque of Strangulation, as it was known in Salah ad-Din's day. And in the middle of those two mosques, the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, why do I mention all this? How does this relate to time? Because again, I'm turning on its head the Jerusalem interpretation of time. Yes, it's about clocks. Yes, it's about the movement of those hands. But it's also about the use of architecture and the use of buildings to mark those events that mark those time. That first minaret in that picture, the minaret of the Mosque of Omar, stands 1/28 of the distance from those 28 holes and 28 steps on the Temple Mount. What is the message of that? It means that the Temple Mount and the Haram al-Sharif, that one of the holiest shrines in Islam, is connected to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre through time and through space. It's a very, very powerful thing. Moving on a little further, you will now see, can we move on to that next bit? There we are, inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And again, time is essential. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is one of the most territorial areas within the city of Jerusalem, where time is absolutely crucial if this place is not to explode into conflict. A closer up of the edicule, the burial place of Jesus traditionally, where Jesus was laid to rest, and where, according to Christian belief, Jesus rose, the site of the resurrection. And then if we look further into who actually manages all of this, Theophilus III, the Greek patriarch of Jerusalem, as you can see him there in full costume. And then moving on, we see the Armenian patriarch, the second most powerful stakeholder in Jerusalem. And then moving on again, we see the Coptic patriarch of Jerusalem, and again, and we move on to see the Syrian Orthodox patriarch. All of these people are involved with the management of the Holy Sepulchre. Who can pray when? Who can pray where? Looking at the hands of that clock, looking at the time, ensuring that one group moves out when one group moves in. Now, you might say, this is utterly unchristian behavior. This is so disappointing. You could argue that, but I think you could also say this is a remarkable and beautiful management of the passion of different pilgrims from different parts of the world that makes Jerusalem work so that pilgrims can come and go on the whole in peace. It's a remarkable, remarkable achievement based upon the status quo agreement, incidentally, of 1757, but based upon centuries of tradition of what went on in the Holy Sepulchre Church. And of course, it's the Israelis that end up managing this whole situation above it with the Israeli police within the church. But generally speaking, it is managed from within the church by the authorities within that building.
Thank you. Other cities have their symbolic clocks, like Big Ben in London and the clock at Grand Central Station in New York City. It seems to me that there aren't that many clocks in Jerusalem. Can you speak a bit about that and tell us about some of the clocks that are or have been here?
Yes, the answer to that will be yes and no. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of clocks in Jerusalem, but not many public clocks. That's the really big difference. And I'll mention those hundreds of thousands of smaller clocks very, very shortly. But here is a clock that people might not know was there. This is Jaffa Gate, the only working gate now on the western side of the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. And Jaffa Gate there has a clock that was built under the orders of Sultan Abdul Hamid, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, to commemorate his Silver Jubilee. 1900, it was ordered as proclamation from Constantinople that 100 clocks were to be built across the Ottoman Empire, and 7 of those were built in the Holy Land, places like Akko, Nazareth, Haifa, Sfat, and other places. They still stand in some of those towns, but not in Jerusalem. Now, it was ordered to be built in 1900. They were pretty much shot up there in 1900 in those other towns in what was then Palestine. But in Jerusalem, it didn't get built to 1907 because there just wasn't the demand for it. There wasn't the great interest. Why did we want a communal time in the city of Jerusalem? Why did we want a business area? This was one of the ideas that was being envisaged, that Jaffa Gate would become a hub of business and so on. So the clock was put up there. By 1922, it had already ceased to work and the British took it down. For 2 reasons, aesthetic reasons. They felt it was a bit of a carbuncle on the top of a wonderful 16th century Suleiman era wall. And secondly, there just was not the consensus that a clock was needed, which to me goes to the whole heart of what Jerusalem is about. It's not about a city that needs a Big Ben or that needs a time equal for everybody, because people are thinking in different time zones, which I'll mention later. And people are thinking in historical times, not just the time of the minute, but the time within centuries. Incidentally, an interesting aside to this is where the stones for this structure were mined from. And the stones from this structure were mined in a quarry just on the northern walls of the old city of Jerusalem, quite close to Damascus Gate, Shechem, Bab al-Amud. And you can see the city walls just above that entrance, just literally almost growing out of the bedrock of the natural rock. Now, these mines at the bottom are sometimes called Zedekiah's Caves. Sometimes they're called King Solomon's Mines. Both are slightly misleading. There is a lot of arguments over what these were used for, but we do know they were used during Second Temple period. They were also partly used to build the walls of Jerusalem in the 16th century, but then it was sensed that it was they'd been over-quarried and quarrying ceased under the orders of Sultan Suleiman at that time. But in 1907, they were used again, the last use of stones for that. What a wonderful circle of time to complete, that you had something that hadn't been used for 2,000 years, and then a gap of 500 years, and then again in the 20th century. The clock was taken down off Jaffa Gate and was moved to this square, the little visited Allenby Square, just in an area of Jerusalem called Romema, behind the bus station. Even there, the poor old clock didn't survive. And eventually it was just vandalized and it ended up on rubbish heaps. There is some talk of bringing bits and pieces of the clock back together. That's a bit of a rumor I've heard. Watch this space. But at the moment, nothing is happening. What was put in its place was an Edwin Lutyens designed memorial to the fallen of the First World War, very similar to the cenotaph in Whitehall in London. So that was the end of that clock. There is one other public clock in London, in Jerusalem. It has a wonderful story, and that's this. Now, this is colloquially known as the Sundial Synagogue, but in fact, the proper name for it is the Beis Medrash Sahare Chama, the study room of the rising sun, of the sunrise. A very enterprising man called Rabbi Samuel came to Jerusalem in 1906. He was a tailor, but also a property investor, and he built a house and then added a floor to it. And the bottom floor was where local immigrants and new pilgrims to Jerusalem could stay at a relatively low cost. Then he built a floor on top of that, where he had a study room. Then he built a floor on top of that, where he had a prayer room. And then he finally decided to build a sundial at the top. And he hired a Rabbi Meah Shearim, who was a watchmaker in Meah Shearim, to design the most wonderful sundial, which is accurate to this day. It was restored in 1986 in Jerusalem and again in 1997. And the reason he put it there is because up until then, many, many Jews and Muslims, in fact, would sometimes have to walk a long way to find out the precise time for prayer, because many people in Jerusalem are very precise in what time sunrise is. The moment that sun cracks over the horizon, it is time to say a specific prayer at a specific time. And equally in Islam, the muezzin will call out a very precise time. So to save people the long journey, Mr. Shapiro and his partner in building this decided to put this in place so that locals wouldn't have to travel a long way to find the precise time for prayer. It's a lovely, lasting example of how clocks can really serve, public clocks can serve, a very good purpose in Jerusalem, despite the failure of the Jaffa Gate one.
Thank you. I understand that actually the Jaffa Gate one, even when it stood, didn't tell the same time on all of its four faces.
Absolutely right. Yes. So no agreement there, even with a public clock. Yes. It ties in with, time generally. It's only in 1848 that time in the United Kingdom became a commonly agreed time when you had a railway system. So right. Countries that have just one time is a relatively recent thing.
So you've told me in the past, Julian, that some Jerusalem residents choose not to live in the same time zone as the rest of us and the rest of the people in the country. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I'm going to show you some pictures. At the moment, it is 6:24 in Jerusalem. Or is it? No, sorry, 8:24 in Jerusalem. Or is it? Because in one community I'm going to show you about, it is right now 9:24 in Jerusalem. And in another community, meters from that, it is 8:24 in Jerusalem. And in a third community, meters from that, it is 8:54 in Jerusalem. They're an hour plus. So remarkable. Let's have a look. What I'm going to point is one small example. There are many other such examples in the city. This is the neighborhood of Meah Shearim, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem. But is it? Because in the next picture, you will see that it's not exclusively for Jews. This is the Romanian Patriarchate, which is on Shifta Yisrael Street, right where Meah Shearim Street comes out and meets. Within this Patriarchate, they go by Eastern European time, Bucharest time, and they're 1 hour behind. These are the nuns with their very distinctive pillbox hats. The place is open for people to go and see if they wish to go and see it, but very few people venture in. And there you can see a close-up of one of the nuns that are there. They live by one time zone, and they operate by that time zone and live their life and their world within that small time zone. And then we have this organization, this Jewish sect. This is the Toldos Avram Yitzchok Rebbe. And the next Rebbe, Grand Rabbi, is the Toldos Aaron Rebbe. Now, they go by a time zone always 1 hour off from what they consider to be the hated Israeli state time. The Toldos Aaron Hasidim came, led by their leader, Reb Aaron Roth, to Jerusalem in the 1930s, or very late 20s, 1928. Their founder died in 1947 and the sect split, and it has had numerous splits since, but they keep to this ritual, or not ritual, this way of living whereby they live by their time, not state time. They maintain they moved to Palestine as it was then. Their love of the land of Israel is complete, but they have a very strong view about the state of Israel. That's for all of you to decide what your views on that is. But this is the reality of parts of Jerusalem, the way people are living. And if you then move on, they dress distinctively, they live distinctively. They live in a subquarter of Meah Shearim, the ultra-Orthodox world, where they live cheek by jowl in a very, very packed place in, I should add, immaculate street conditions. They clean their own streets. They don't allow municipal workers into it. And they are absolutely strict upon time and how time rules their lives. They actually live their lives more like Lithuanian religious people. High birth rate, as you can see, lots and lots of children. And moving on again, You can see here the way they dress, very distinctive. Look at that. It's a hark back. This is a Purim, but it's actually a hark back to Ottoman dress, because that's when they came to Jerusalem. In obviously the late Mandate period, but the late Mandate period was heavily influenced by the Ottomans. And they wear robes that actually have time codes within them. The robes have certain elements to them, the men with the golden robes, the women with black dresses and pearls. The men's robes particularly have number patterns in them that remind them of certain commandments to do with time. Time, 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 always there, even in what they wear. These last two pictures of that, of this particular set, are particularly poignant, I suppose. I always used to mock these Hasidim about their slavish addiction to absolutely going against the time of the state. And prior to me leaving Jerusalem, I lived there 2002 to 2006, they presented me with a clock. And there is the clock in the shape of the Dome of the Rock. It's a Dome of the Rock alarm clock, and it was a wonderful moment. They had really taken ribbing from me over the years about their stance on certain things. They knew of my fascination with the various religions of the city, and there is a wonderful thing in a house that was built by Armenian Christians. Me holding the Dome of the Rock, one of the shrines of Islam, presented to me by a group of Toldos Aaron Hasidim. It's a great moment.
So Julian, we've got 2 minutes left and 2 questions. So first, are there any communities in Jerusalem that can be said to live in defiance of time, to ignore it altogether?
Wow, yeah. Yes, there are. And I would say more, certainly communities and if not individuals. This is the Monasteries of St. Anuphius. It's in the navel of 3 key valleys, the Kidron Valley that sweeps down to the east, and the Tyropian Valley that shoots up to the north, and the Hinnom Valley that really, really rockets straight up towards Jaffa Gate. And in the navel of those 3 key biblical valleys is Anuphius's monastery, that for many, many years refused to have clocks. It would not go by any time whatsoever. And some in that monastery were so, particularly when the monastery then gained clocks, some people moved out. They were disgusted by the fact that the monastery played the time game, and they wanted to stand out against this. And look at some of these characters. So here is Silwan, the village, very, very close, overlooking Anuphius's monastery. And if you just look in with the cursor there, you will see small holes there. Go to the next one. These are caves, certainly from the Second Temple period, if not even earlier. On the next picture, you'll see a slightly closer up of some of these caves within. There you have it again. Now, within these caves, and there's many of them peppering the side of the hills, are these, the residences of hermits, those that have eschewed time and have absolutely said, we will not play the time game. No clocks there. No, none of that cycle of life that I taught of. And there is Father Iwakim, one of the people that lives in one of these places. And to follow is one of the very famous nuns shortly. This is the stigmata, the tradition that some people, really pious Christians, can sometimes be hit and suffer the wounds of the passion of Christ. And there are some that live within Jerusalem in those caves who suffer those wounds, whether it's psychosomatic, whether it's a miracle, whether they are trying to gain saintly status. Again, that's for you to decide. But these people, watch the next picture if you are not squeamish. This is Sister Salome, who bleeds the wounds of the stigmata, the tears of Jesus, the crown of thorns, the wounds on her head, the bleeding of the hands from the crucifixion. And she suffers these wounds, but she does not live a life like others. Or am I incorrect? Because there she is again. There she is again, ready to drink a G&T with me at a party, which is partly the wonder of Jerusalem, that people can compartmentalize time, piety, enjoying yourselves. It's a very Jerusalem thing, the ability to compartmentalize, just as time compartmentalizes.
So last question. New York City is or used to be known as the city that never sleeps, but it seems to me, based on many things I've heard you say in the past, that title really belongs to Jerusalem. What do you think about that?
I completely agree. And a very, very brief memory I have was walking around Jerusalem as a 16-year-old boy in 1981 with a very eminent archaeologist, of his time, who subsequently became a politician. And we were walking around, we were meant to meet for an hour, and the hour turned into 2 and into 3, and we ended up walking around Jerusalem the whole night till dawn. And at the end of that, or towards the end, I said, you know, wouldn't it just be better with the hatreds and the conflicts? And yes, these things are managed by time, but it's still a sad city in many ways. And could it not be resolved just if a bomb was dropped on the whole city, all the holy sites go? It doesn't kill anyone, some sort of neutron bomb. It doesn't kill anyone, but it really gets rid of the holy sites, and then everyone could start again back into Jerusalem. And he burst out laughing. He said, and you call yourself somebody that knows about Jerusalem, Julian? How can you even think such a thing? You have a profound misunderstanding of what Jerusalem is, because time in Jerusalem is as it is that it sets people into belief systems. And if a bomb had landed on Jerusalem and destroyed the holy sites, people would then end up worshipping the holy hole. It wouldn't change. Nothing would change. Jerusalem would go on and on and on. And I suppose my message to people would be that Jerusalem is there for everyone. Yes, there are many Jerusalems for many people. There's the Jerusalems of the classic tours and wonderful tours. And there's the Jerusalem of the bazaars and of the food and of the history and the architecture of the place. And there's also the Jerusalem of the sects of the city. And if there is one way to get into those sects, and anybody can do it at any time, because I've never found anything other than warmth and welcoming from people of any sect in any part of the city at any time of day and night. If there's one way to do it, it's to get out of your comfort zone, to envelop yourself into it, to love being completely overwhelmed by it all, and to use time and the people's use of time as almost as a portal to get into the spirit of that city.
So thank you, Julian Barnett, for that really extraordinary introduction to Jerusalem time. For those of us who live in Jerusalem or visit it often, you've truly opened our eyes and ears. And I really can't wait to see your forthcoming YouTube channel. I think starting with 70 short films of your travels in London with other cities to follow. So everyone should look out for that. Thank you, Julian.
My great pleasure. Thank you all.
So welcome to session 2 of Jerusalem Time, a 7-part exploration of time in Jerusalem and beyond at the time of Corona. This symposium is taking place under the umbrella of Jerusalem Tolerance's Yom Yerushalmim, promoting diversity in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day, which began tonight and every day. In this session, Bein Hazmanim, which literally means between the times, Professor Moshe Halbertal will talk to Josh Schoenfeld about time as an organizing principle in the life of a yeshiva bocher. Moshe Halbertal is Professor of Jewish Thought and Philosophy at Hebrew University and Gruss Professor of Law at NYU Law School. He is the author and co-author of many books in English and Hebrew, including in English, Idolatry, People of the Book, Concealment and Revelation, On Sacrifice, Maimonides, and most recently, The Beginning of Politics, Power in the Biblical Book of Samuel. Moshe received the Michael Bruner Memorial Award of the Rothschild Foundation and the Goldstein-Gorin Book Award for the best book in Jewish thought, published between 1997 and 2000. A biography of Nachmanides in English is forthcoming. Josh Schoenfeld grew up in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities of Brooklyn and Woodmere, Long Island, and after high school moved to Jerusalem to learn full-time in a yeshiva, a traditional Torah academy. As a young father learning at Jerusalem's Meah Yeshiva, arguably the Harvard of the yeshiva world, Josh decided to apply to US law schools. Last year, he graduated from Yale Law School. Josh is now learning Torah again in a kollel, a yeshiva for married men in Dallas. At the end of the year, he'll join the Dallas office of a prestigious New York law firm in their tax department. Thank you very much and welcome to Moshe and Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Josh, I want to start. Thank you, Diana, for bringing us all together here and having a different kind of celebration of Jerusalem. And I want to begin, Josh, with something that struck me as a very peculiar experience of time in the yeshiva that has to do with the concept of bitul Torah, right? The idea that what I would call time piety, or the guilt of time. Can you reflect on that experience of the preciousness of time?
Absolutely, I think that's a great question. In terms of the way bittul Torah, right, the wasting of time of not learning Torah in the yeshiva world, particularly in the yeshivas I've learned in, it's not so much that the fear and the guilt of bittul Torah, of here I am not spending my time studying Torah, right? I'm committing a sin, right? Something, right? I'm going to get punished for that. I'm doing something wrong. I think that the driving force behind most of the study of Torah in yeshivas, and every yeshiva will have its own method, own way of approaching it, right? Is more. There's two crude ways to explain how to serve God in yeshiva, right? There's serving God from fear, right? Fear of punishment, and serving God from love, because you love God and you love your relationship with God. And I think the driving force in yeshivas behind the study of Torah is the latter, is the love of God. And I don't think that most students would feel that guilt that they're wasting their time. And I think time in at least in Judaism, in the yeshiva world, and I would imagine in all religions, time is very precious. Every second you have is not a second you're getting back. Right? You have one chance to use this moment, right? And the way you use that moment will be eternal, right? Every moment, every second is eternal. And knowing that, right, the utilization of your time to its full potential is extremely important. So therefore, the driving force in yeshiva is that you have this limited amount of time, right? So you have to use as much of that time as possible to learn Torah, to study and to perform the commandments and to get closer to God. There's the famous parable often used by many Jewish philosophers and those who teach Musar and bettering yourself, right? Is a king calls one of his poor people, right? Well, a peasant, right? And he says, "I'm going to open my treasury for 1 hour. You can come into my treasury. There are bags there. You could fill as many bags as you want with jewels and diamonds and gold, right? And you can carry it all out, put it in a wagon outside. At the end of the hour, I'm closing the doors." So the peasant walks into the king's palace, very excited, and he walks in, and the first room he walks in, there's a huge feast spread out, the best foods you can imagine, the top chefs, everything that you can imagine, and everyone's calling him over, like, come, just eat one thing, right? Just enjoy this one thing, and then you have plenty of time. You go and you get your diamonds, right? So every moment that he wastes, right, eating the food and enjoying the other pleasures, he's not gathering those diamonds. So is it a fear? Is it a fear that's driving him to get those diamonds? Because he's afraid that the king's going to yell at him. The king's like, I gave you this opportunity, you wasted it, right? That's not what's driving. What's driving him is that he wants as many diamonds as he can have when that hour is up, right? So what happens if the king tells him you have a day? What happens if he tells him you have a week, right? So at some point, he's not going to spend every single moment collecting diamonds. He'll try to prioritize his time. If he has 24 hours, maybe he'll sleep for 2 or 3 hours in order to have energy. If he has a week, he'll adjust accordingly. And I think that's the same concept that applies in yeshiva, right? And I think all yeshivas to different extents, right, in addition to having that primary focus on learning as much Torah as possible and spending as much time, in the base measures, in the study hall, studying Torah, there's also a extremely large focus on the health and wellness of the students, right? Every yeshiva will have what they call mashgichim, people who watch out for the students, not just to lead them spiritually, but also to make sure that they're not overextending themselves. There's always this conflict between idealism and realism. Right? And idealism is, if I could, I would spend every single moment of every single day, 24/7, in the study hall, studying as much Torah as I can. Right? But realistically, that's not possible. I mean, in yeshiva, the students, they look up at the great Torah scholars. They look at them and they see that they spend hours and hours on end studying Torah, right? The Vilna Gaon lived a couple hundred years ago, one of the greatest Torah scholars that lived in the past couple hundred years. Right? They say about him that he was able to count on one finger the amount of minutes he spent in Bittul Torah, wasting time for an entire year. So like, there's that idealistic view, like, I want to be like that, right? That's amazing. I should be like that also. But then there's the realism. If I try to sit every single moment of every day learning Torah, then yeah, for the first day, maybe 2 days, I'll learn a lot of Torah if I have enough coffee. But going forward, it's going to destroy me, right? So it's more of a marathon, right, than a sprint, as they say, right? It's how can I maximize my time, right, to use my time accordingly, like to spend a lot of time learning Torah, and then in the long run, I'll be able to benefit more from it. I think that's the attitude.
Sure. So I want to, we have this concept called, in relationship to time consuming, right? Which is an interesting metaphor. So I want to understand, I want to go a little further into the description of Bitul Torah. I remember when I was in a yeshiva, so just to show time piety, I don't think there is any, maybe, I'm not sure there is any other religion or religious tradition that has this spectacle of time piety. So the head of my yeshiva was asked, what is a sechadat? What is, letting your mind wander? So he picked his eyes from the book, just picking the eye from the book is already a sechadat. So I want to ask about this concept of time consuming. Right, there is a Gemara that asks, can I study Greek wisdom? So it said, find yourself a time which is neither day nor night, and study Greek wisdom, because it says V'agita bo yomam v'layla. Now you should study day and night. Now here is another idea of time consuming, right? The idea that the very beautiful description of the preciousness of time, every second of it consumes, has a kind of an overarching expectation, demand that doesn't allow a leisure or even other pursuits, that the kind of a powerful, all-inclusive, consuming aspect.
Yeah, and I would add, like, there's another passage from the Talmud which says that anyone who performs Bittul Torah, it's better that he was never created. Even a moment of Bittul Torah is never created. So obviously there's this amazingness to not wasting your time, right? And the preciousness of every moment and not wasting it. And I think that, there's just to add in, there's another concept, right, in Judaism, that when someone who's involved in performing one commandment, there are 613 commandments, is not obligated to perform a second commandment if that commandment comes up. So if you're in middle of one of the commandments is serving your mother or father, just an example. So if you're in the middle of getting a glass of water for your father, right, and then a poor person knocks on your door and asks you for money, right? So he wants you to give him charity, which is another commandment. So you are not obligated to give him money at that time because you're in middle of serving your father, which is another commandment. One notable exception to that is Torah. When it comes to learning Torah, that's the only mitzvah that even if you're involved in the mitzvah of Torah, so you're not excluded from doing another mitzvah. So if you are involved in learning Torah and another mitzvah, another commandment comes up, you have to go ahead and you have to do that other mitzvah, right? So now there's like this interesting contrast between Torah, so I'm supposed to spend every moment learning Torah. I'm not supposed to waste any of my time, but now if something else comes up, I'm supposed to leave my Torah and go do that. So which one is more important? Which one weighs more? So the basic answer is that yes, like Torah is the most important. But what is the goal of learning Torah? So obviously the goal of learning Torah is of studying Torah is to maximize this amount of time, is to accumulate as much gold and diamonds as you can, right, before your time in this world ends, right? But the Talmud says and the sages say that the only Torah which is precious is the study of Torah is going to bring about action. right? To merely sit in a study hall, in an office, and read and study Torah all day. So there's something very notable about that. But if you don't internalize what you're doing, right? So then what's the point, right? So therefore, like what you study in Torah, you study all the commandments, you study all the intricacies and all the all the different ways to understand the different commandments. But if you're not going to go ahead and perform those commandments when they come up, so then it's useless. So therefore, so while Torah is the primary focus, like all these other things are different things that come out from studying Torah. And so, in terms of time management and the preciousness of time, for example, if let's say another commandment doesn't come up, so I think there's always a thought. There's always a thought is why am I doing what I'm doing? I mean, like why am I going to eat? Right? Why am I taking a break from the study of Torah to go eat a meal? Am I going because I'm going to enjoy this meal a lot? And it could be you will, and that's fine if you do. But or is the reason why you're taking a break is to give yourself energy? Why am I taking a nap now? Do I need energy to continue to? Why am I going out with friends? Why am I going to play ball? Right? All these things are necessary in order to maximize the preciousness of every moment. If I didn't have an outlet for my other energies, if I didn't take time to eat, didn't take time to sleep, didn't take time to be with family, and I turned into a depressed person, so then the Torah study would suffer on the other hand. Right. So while yes, looking up from your sefer is taking away from looking up from the book that you're studying is taking away from the preciousness of your study, right? But again, it's the focus in yeshivas is always as you say, the preciousness of time, but also teaching you time management for the rest of your life, and that's what it is, and that's why I mean when we speak about the structure of the day, that's what it's focused on. It's focused on giving you as much Torah as possible while still giving you the ability to be a functional person, and not to just be sitting all day.
So I want to now come back and circle back to our previous discussion, Julian's discussion, beautiful discussion on time in Jerusalem. I want to talk about the concept of sacred time, Shabbat, and it will bring us to the experience, is there a Shabbat in a yeshiva? I remember myself in yeshiva and thinking exactly what is the difference between Shabbat and Friday. I'm doing the same thing exactly, which is studying. But I would come to, I want to talk about the concept of sacred time and move from there to sacred space. Because there is one feature, and the notion of the holy or the notion of sacred is such a complex category in all religions, right? And in Yahadut as well. But there is one feature that defines sacred time, which is the prohibition of work. Isur melacha, right? The only days that we do kiddush, that we sanctify the day by kiddush, is days that are asurim b'melacha, you're prohibited from work, right? This is why Hanukkah might be a holiday, might be a festival, but it's not mikra'ei kodesh, it's not sacred, because sacredness means you're not allowed to own the world in this time, right? It's the removal of ownership and control. I think the same comes with the question of sacred space, right? The Mishnah says, what is the sacredness of a synagogue? You're not allowed to make a shortcut through the synagogue, right? Lo yaseu kapandria. So the idea of the concept of the sacred is the realm in which you give up sovereignty, you give up control. You cannot manipulate the world or space or time in that sacred zone. That leads me to the following thought, apropos Jerusalem, that I find religiously almost outrageous, the idea that if it's sacred to me, it's mine. Because the very idea of it being sacred means it's not yours, right? In the sovereign sense of the word, right? So what is, if we come back then to the concept of Shabbat, the sacred day, the sacred time, How do you experience that in the world of the yeshiva, or in the way you think about it in general as well?
Yeah, and I love the way you describe it as a sacred time, right? As not like, I think the classic way to define Shabbos, which I think is an incorrect definition of Shabbos, is a day of rest. Right? That's not what it is. Right? Shabbos is not a day of rest. It's a sacred time. It's a special time between a Jew and his creator, right? And God. It's not that day of rest. Just to give an example of that, right? So obviously there are biblical decrees, and then there are rabbinic decrees which came on afterwards. Biblically speaking, I can work next year when I'm in a law firm. I can go ahead and I can work. I can get in a taxi. Right? I can get in a taxi and not drive a car. He can drop me off at work. I can not work on my computer, but I can read case books. I can sign a document with my left hand. I can do a lot of things. And biblically speaking, I kept Shabbos. I did a lot of things. I can go into negotiations. I could do a lot of things. Biblically speaking, there are a lot of rabbinic decrees in that.
Great scholar to do all of that, yeah.
Sorry?
You have to be a real Talmid Chochem to do it.
Yes.
In ways of not violating the Shabbat.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but the point is that as you were saying, right, like the time that we have on Shabbos is not so much as a time like I've been working all week. Now I can take a break. I can sit back. I can relax. I can, recharge my batteries for the next week. Right. That's not what the Shabbos is about. The Shabbos is about the sanctity of Shabbos, about that special connection that we have. Right, God rested on the seventh day, and we're resting on the seventh day. That connection that we have with God at that time, and because I think in most of the Jewish world, I think, and in most of the world in general, view what the Shabbos is, right? They view it as that day of rest. I mean, most people come home from work at the end of the week, and I'm able to sit down. I can rest. I can spend some time with my family, right? But that's a very common misconception of what Shabbos is. And he says Shabbos is a sacred time, and because of that, in the yeshivas as well, right? So Shabbos is treated as a sacred time. There are a lot externally. There are a lot of similarities, as you were saying, between the weekday and Shabbos. Right? The same way you could walk into 10 different yeshivas, everybody there is wearing a white shirt and black pants. They all look exactly the same, but under the surface, everything is different. Right? So same thing on Shabbos, right? Things are different than the rest of the week. So in yeshivas, we're learning the week. So during the whole week, right? There's a structure to the day, and most of that structure is provided, right, by the yeshiva, by the school. Right? They dictate what we're in general, what is to be learned in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evenings. And then there's, right, those are called the Sidorim, right? The three main orders of the day that you have, and in between is Bein HaSidorim, in between the Sidorim, where you kind of learn your own things. So in yeshivas, Shabbos is a time where people can focus on things that they may enjoy a lot more. So they focus on certain studies of Torah that they may enjoy a lot more, because again, enjoying yourself on Shabbos, right, increases the sanctity, increases the specialness of that day, and that's I think that's a large focus. Obviously, there's a lot of other things going on Shabbos, right? You're spending more time praying. You're enjoying family, right? You're eating hopefully good food, right? There's a lot of other things that are going on Shabbos, but in terms of the Torah learning, right, and the time that's spent learning Torah, so it's really primarily used, right, as a way to review what you're doing the week, and to get into things that you normally wouldn't have time, right, to get into during the week, and it really, which makes it a great break from the rest of the week. For 6 days, you're in yeshiva and you're studying primarily the same thing, right? Whatever tractate the yeshiva is learning at that time, you're spending 80% of your time studying that particular subject. Right? Shabbos is a way to shift gears, right? To move on to something else, whether you enjoy studying halacha more, whether you enjoy studying, right, just studying some thoughts on the Torah, on the Parsha, as opposed to the Gemara and the Talmud. Right? So Shabbos really is really that time. So it's kind of a time to recharge, right? Because it's a time to recharge in the sense that I'm not stopping what I'm doing. I'm just shifting gears. I'm going to something else. I'm gonna focus my time on something else. I think that's the main attitude in the yeshivas in how to approach time.
Wonderful. And would you want to think about the concept of a sacred place in relationship to sacred time, right? what do we mean by the concept of Kedushat HaMakom, right? Jerusalem is really an overlapping maps of the sacred, right? You have maps of sacred overlapping on top of one another, which brings all the beauty and the risk of the city. How do we conceptualize the concept of the sacred space? And is a Beit Midrash also a sacred space? The Beis Medrash, the space. How do we view this concept?
I think so. There, I mean, obviously, like you're explaining, that there are different types of sacred places, right? And in the times of the temple, right, the temple itself was an extremely sacred place, right? Anybody who was impure, from one of the numerous ways the Jew could become impure, who stepped on the temple was punishable by death, right? Just walking there, right, in a state of impurity was something extremely wrong, something that you should be killed for, right? And that is the ultimate level of the sacredness of a place, right? So the Talmud says that today, where there is no temple, so where does God rest, right? God rests in between the four walls of the study hall, right? So the study hall has now become God's resting place in this world, right? So while walking into the study hall in a state of impurity is probably not punishable by death, right? That same concept, that same feeling, that when I'm walking into the place where God is, right? God is everywhere, but what his main resting place, the place that he wants to be more, the place that he wants to be close to you, that's the study hall, right? So walking into there, and like you mentioned the Talmud, like walking through a Beis Knesset, walking through a synagogue, right? To use it as a shortcut, right? That's prohibited, because you're ignoring, you're flaunting, right? You're flaunting in the face of God, right? God is there. He's waiting for you to come there to talk to him, to study his Torah, and instead you pass right through, right? So that's the concept, right, of a sacred place, right? This is where God is waiting for you. And it's similar, and it's very similar to the concept of sacred time, right? You have this sacred time. You have this, for example, Shabbos, right? That's sacred time where you can use it to maximize the rest of the week. You can use it to shift gears, to study something that you normally wouldn't study the rest of the week, and instead you decide, this Shabbos I'm just going to rest. I'm going to spend a couple extra hours in my bed, right? I'm just use it for resting, right? So that's taking the sacredness of that time, right? And you're just discarding it, right? Similar to taking a shortcut through a synagogue, right? You're discarding that sacredness. You're showing that it's not important to you, right? So these are both, right? Just the Talmud also brings down the story of a couple of sages, right? That they had a separate study hall and a separate synagogue in their town. So everybody would go to the synagogue to study, to pray, and they were studying in the study hall, right, in the Beis Medrash. So when time came to go daven, they wouldn't go to the Beis Medrash, to the synagogue, because since they would study Torah in the Beis Medrash, it was so holy, it was so precious to them, that they didn't want to leave this place to go talk to God somewhere else. They wanted to talk to God in this holy place, right? So it just a little bit to illustrate, like the view that we take towards the preciousness of a study hall, right? The sacredness of a place, and the sacredness of the time that you spend in such a place.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Josh and Diana.
Thank you.
You're our host and leader, so it's all yours.
So that was really amazing. And a very big frustration of this is that suddenly, both Julian and now the two of you, we could listen to for so much longer. You've got so much to teach us that was really so illuminating and inspiring. And thank you both very, very much, Josh Schoenfeld and Professor Moshe Halbertal. So our next session is Sanitation is a Philosophy of Time. Welcome to session 3 of Jerusalem Time, a 7-part exploration of time in Jerusalem and beyond at the time of Corona. This symposium is taking place under the umbrella of Jerusalem Tolerance's Yom Yerushalmim, promoting diversity in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day, which began tonight and every day. In this session, Toby Pell-Freilich will talk to Muriel Lederman-Ukeles about the role of time in maintenance art. Muriel Ukeles is the official unsalaried artist in residence at the New York City's Department of Sanitation since 1977. Her performance artworks, installations, sculptures, drawings, and videos break boundaries between labor and art, teaching us what unites feminism, workers, the city, and the environment. In 2017, the Queen's Museum in New York ran a major retrospective, and Muriel's artworks have recently been acquired for permanent collections of the Whitney, Guggenheim, Migros, and New York Jewish museums. Her honorary doctorates include the Art Institute of Chicago. Toby Pell-Freilich is a documentary producer and director, as well as a journalist, who lives between Jerusalem and New York. Her films include Moynihan, Inventing Our Life, The Kibbutz Experiment, and Secret Lives, Hidden Children and Their Rescuers. Her journalism has appeared in Tablet, the Jewish Review of Books, Shema, and The Forward. Toby is currently producing and directing a film about Muriel Lederman-Ukeles.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you for organizing this evening's event. We have this short amount of time to discuss two very complex works by Muriel Lederman-Ukeles. Both relate to time, our subject tonight, but each in different ways. The first work we'll be looking at is called Cleansing the Bad Names. It has its roots in one of Muriel's best known works, a performance artwork called Touch Sanitation. Touch Sanitation was her inaugural work as artist in residence for the city's Department of Sanitation. Before Muriel even began Touch Sanitation, she spent a year and a half researching and learning about the complex system of sanitation and listening to the workers. In performing Touch Sanitation, she followed in the footsteps of sanitation workers, who were all men at the time, for 11 months on their daily rotations throughout New York City, through sun and snow, night and day, creating a visual mapping of the never-ending work of New York City's living entity. In that long span of time that she spent researching and then performing Touch Sanitation, her appreciation for the workers' endurance, their courage, spirit, and civic loyalty grew. She learned of the dangers they were confronting on the job, the humiliations and frustrations they were suffering, and the substandard conditions under which they were working. This was at the height of New York City's fiscal crisis, and the city was considering selling the entire sanitation department to a private charter industry. So even as their working conditions were deteriorating, the sanitation workers were also worried about losing their jobs, their livelihood. This is the context in which Touch Sanitation played out. And as part of the work, Muriel shook the hand of each of the department's 8,500 sanitation men, saying, "Thank you for keeping New York City alive." The work we're going to discuss first, Cleanse in Touch Sanitation Project. It was inspired by a personal story conveyed to Muriel by a single sanitation worker as she performed Touch Sanitation, and which she never forgot. Like Touch Sanitation, the work we're about to discuss, Cleansing the Bad Names, is a performance work. And because it's experienced over time, Muriel will be illustrating this work through multiple images, almost like a film, spanning 1979 to 1980. A final note about the work, Cleansing. It's rooted in a single personal experience between Muriel and one sanitation worker. And when it opened at the Ronald Feldman Gallery in 1984, the performance itself involved almost 200 representatives from many sectors of society who were served by sanitation workers. The sanitation workers and their families sat and witnessed the performance. So Muriel, now I'm going to turn to you and get to our subject tonight. When I think about time in relation to cleansing the bad name, aloft, for anger to cool, for forgiveness to ripen. Healing can also be achieved through an act of tikkun or repair, even many years after the insult, and can even bring about instantaneous results. So,
hi, Toby.
Hi.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you, Diana. It's thrilling to be here in this incredibly diverse and very interesting group of subjects and people. Okay, I'm going to start. I'm going to back up a little bit to the what the cleansing the bad names came from, and that is the overall performance work called touch sanitation. Here are a few images from the performance itself. I arrive in time for 6 a.m. roll call and speak to the gathering of all the sanitation men. At that time, as Toby said, an all-male workforce. Maintenance, I speak about maintenance, that I am a maintenance artist. I think our culture doesn't honor maintenance work inside of the home or maintenance work outside on the streets that you, speaking to the sanitation workers, that you do. If you think of the city as our common home, then the inside workers and the outside workers are the same. Keeping the home, keeping the city. It is ridiculous that this work is culturally invisible, not honored. I say the work that you do keeps the city alive. Time to change all this, rupture this bubble. Then I face each of 8,500 sanitation workers, shake hands with each person, and say to each person, thank you for keeping New York City alive. This is the day 3 of the performance artwork. I am in Brooklyn. This garage section office has holes in the roof, broken toilets with few doors, group sinks like sinks for horses, broken showers, and no budget for improvements. Furniture hauled in from the streets. By the way, is everybody seeing the slides?
Yeah, but they're not seeing you.
They are? Okay, thank you. The design of this artwork is the itinerary I drew up after many months of planning to go everywhere. How do I find 8,500 sandmen? I make 10 sweeps around the city. First district in Manhattan, first district in the Bronx, first district in Brooklyn, first district in Queens, first district in Staten Island. Then I start all over again in Manhattan. I keep coming back like they do. The art is a spiraling human mapping of the city's underbelly, the city as a living human entity. This performance took place during the terrible fiscal crisis of the 1970s. About 65% of the trucks were not operable during those days, although the necessity to dump thousands and thousands of pounds and tons of garbage every day didn't go away. No budget for maintenance. Here are a lineup of loaded trucks lined up at a transfer station in the Bronx. A few months later, I'm having lunch with Sandmen in their section office in Harlem, located in a former jail, because it's hard for sanitation workers to get past the NIMBY syndrome to get real estate. I always spend at least an 8-hour day, sometimes a double shift of 16 hours. I come at roll call, I walk with them as they load or sweep. We eat, we walk again, and we walk again. People are angry. Much of the time, I listen. Besides being angry that people don't see them, even though they are working out on the street every day doing dangerous work, they are concerned that the sanitation department will be sold to the private carter industry because they are not valued. People were afraid that they would lose their jobs. They took these jobs not because they love your garbage, but because they were willing to trade their strength and their skill to count on a job that wouldn't go away, where they would get benefits. They could enter the American dream and get a mortgage for their families. I thought this performance would take 3 months. It ended up taking 11 months to touch sanitation, the allness of it. Now we're going to switch to focus on cleansing the bad names that Toby spoke about before. I'm in a Brooklyn landfill. Here I am, standing in the garbage, next to a sandman who has just dumped his truck. He takes off his glove. We shake hands. I say, "Thank you for keeping New York City alive." "Can I tell you a story?" he asks. "Sure, I heard a lot of stories." 17 years ago, we were picking up in Brooklyn. It was very hot, in the 90s, very humid. We loaded this lady's garbage and sat down on her porch steps to take a break. She opened the door and she said, "Get away from here, you smelly garbage men. I don't want you stinking up my porch." For 17 years, he continued, that stuck in my throat. Today, you wiped that out. Here we are. It's a miracle that I had a photographer with me. Here we are after he had said this to me. Now, to me, that was the best thing that ever happened to me as an artist. 17 years of time choking his soul, suddenly melted, opening, boom, my art worked. We are so excited. Then he said something else. "Will you remember that?" What? Did he think I could forget? It meant so much, and I could just forget it in a few minutes? Or maybe he was saying something else, challenging me, like, "Listen, artist, now it's time for you to do your job and spread this story to others." So I decided to rebuild the lady's porch, to play it again, so that the whole society or symbolic representatives could wipe that out for him and all the others, to make this story come out right. With the help of headquarters, here's a copy of the memo that the head of operations sent to all personnel in the Department of Sanitation's facilities, asking for, quote, the worst defamatory names that the public have called sanitation personnel. Written in classic bureaucraties, the names needed to be this accurate. Here is the response of one section with some of the bad names. We got back hundreds of bad names. Sandmen were called on the street. Can you see that? Can you see the names?
Yes.
Here's the ladies' porch, rebuilt over the entrance to the Ronald Feldman Gallery in Soho. We painted the bad names we received over 75 running feet of glass windows and doors. Up against the glass, we installed 2 levels of scaffolding to enable 190 people representing many different sectors of society that I invited to wipe out, to scrub out the bad names. It would be an act of exchange, just as it is the job of the Sandmen to cleanse the city of our waste. It is our job to cleanse, to wash away the bad names, bad attitudes, wrong, stupid thinking that leads people to call these names to sanitation workers right in their faces in public. This exchange, turnaround, switch of tasks is the essence of this ritual and the art. You see me standing on the porch at the opening. I am telling the story. 17 years ago, it was very hot. We closed Mercer Street in front of the gallery. All along the long rows of chairs sat the viewers who became witnesses of this ritual action. Mostly, these people that you see are sanitation workers and their families. Here are some of the participants washing away the bad names. Lucy Lepard, the art writer, and John Coleman, Foundation president, and a child. Cleansing, many cleansing tears were shed that day. This is the great artist Helene Alon washing away, who recently passed away, struck down by the COVID-19 virus.
Wow.
Now, maybe let's go on to the next project.
Yeah, that was a powerful note to end on. Well, the second work we're going to be talking about now is, unlike cleansing, it's not a temporal performance work, but a material work. It's experienced by the, it's called 1 Year's Work Time 2, and it was part of a museum-wide career-spanning exhibit of Murrell's work at the Queen's Museum in New York City in 2016-2017. Another difference between the first work that we just explored, and this work, is that 1 year's work time is rooted in the collective experiences of all the sanitation workers, rather than in a single personal story. It's really about the system of sanitation itself. Now, Muriel, you have said to me that sanitation is a philosophy of time. And in that context, you recalled your father's favorite Psalm, chapter 90, verse 12, which is, "So teach us to number our days, that we may get us a heart of wisdom." How does this particular Psalm inform 1 year's work time when you consider it today?
I'll respond to your statement about how does this relate to Psalm 90, verse 12. In 2016, 2017, I had a 50-year career survey at the Queen's Museum in New York City, as Toby mentioned. Here is the poster advertising the exhibition. When you are the artist in residence of sanitation, oops, wait a minute. Oh, heck. No, yeah. When you are the artist in residence of sanitation, you get to put the poster over 2,900, actually more, trucks and sweepers advertising the show all over the city every day. Now, to respond to your question about how does this relate to the quotation in Psalm 90, it's about how to create meaning, how to value every single day. Actually, the other speakers spoke about the same thing, about every precious moment, not losing the second that is eternal. That's the goal of this psalm, which my father loved and tried to practice, and which has always resided in my heart. Here we are inside the main gallery of the museum on the Great Wall, 30 feet high and over 100 feet long. This is my print installation called 1 Year's Work Time. I believe that sanitation, besides cleaning the streets, removing the waste and recyclables and snow, really is a visual philosophy of time. You are looking at one entire year's time in one shot. The first layer of the print is a wall of clocks. Sanitation is lunatic about counting every hour. Every clock, however, on this artwork has only 8 hours, and 4 hours are blocked out. This shows a work shift, one work shift of 8 hours, a humane Western invention. You can have my brain, you can have my body for 8 hours and not more, or pay for overtime. Behind the clocks, a second layer picturing a collage of thousands and thousands of sanitation work forms, gazillion of work forms signed every day by thousands of workers. The third layer of the prints are the gradual shifting colors of the 4 seasons: spring green, summer sky blue, maroon for fall. And then you'll notice that winter is not white, but snow emergency red-orange, like the snow plows. These colors float behind the clocks through the whole year. This is 1 year. We can do this. A whole year is in our hands. It says we have made a huge decision as a culture that we have the right and the operational expertise and the work power to live in the present, in today. We deserve to do the work that can maintain the present, This is astonishing. We don't have to walk on the horse droppings and waste of yesterday, always dragging them along from the day before. You know, New York City used to look like that and be like that, but no more. What you're looking at is the very expensive decision that we have made, and it reflects an aspect of our society's wisdom and wealth to treasure every hour. Here's a closer view. We also still have to decide to create what it takes not only to be here in the present, but what it will take to be here tomorrow and the day after. As a culture, we haven't really made that decision yet. Here's a time-lapse video of the installation of this wall.
Thank you, Meryl. You know, that was almost, that video is like an ode to maintenance. And just some quick final thoughts about maintenance. Your work gave voice to that whole category of maintenance. And maintenance really is care for an existing object, a person or a system, as opposed to creating something brand new and moving on. And when Meryl invented maintenance art in 1969, it just wasn't part of the culture. It was not part of the discussion. And I think Meryl's maintenance art reminds us that maintenance itself is a skill. It's work that happens at fixed intervals over time, and it's never finished. But it is essential to slow or mend the degradations wrought by time on our homes, on our buildings, our infrastructure, and on the earth itself. So in that respect, maintenance is work that's very closely linked to repair and renewal. And at its core, it's deeply life-affirming. Meryl, did you have a final thought about maintenance and time?
At this moment of utter vulnerability of us all, we need to honor and even celebrate our interdependence. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you, Toby and Meryl. That was really, really extraordinary. And I think a meditation on maintenance and time, the presence of time in maintenance that we could never have thought of on our own. That some of the things we're hearing, yes, we're familiar, that bringing them in a new light, but this is really something that I think is hidden, so deeply hidden from most of us. And we're very, very grateful to both of you for that extraordinary presentation and for bringing it out. So our next presentation is called Short of Time. Welcome to session 4 of Jerusalem Time, a 7-part exploration of time in Jerusalem and beyond at the time of Corona. This symposium is taking place under the umbrella of Jerusalem Tolerance's Yom Yerushalmim, promoting diversity in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day, which began tonight and every day. In this session, Short of Time, Dr. Ruth Austrian will talk to Micha Price about the distinctive role of time in the life of a young climate activist. Ruth Austrian received her PhD in experimental neuropsychology from the University of Pennsylvania and held postdoctoral fellowships at the universities of Vienna and Cambridge. She directed the joint offices of the Nathan Cummings and Dorot Foundations in Israel for 6 years prior to joining the management of Yad HaNadiv in 2001. 12 years ago, Ruth established and currently directs the Environment and Health Fund, dedicated to improving population health in Israel through better research, policy, and public understanding of environmental influences on health. Micha Price was born and raised in Jerusalem. After completing his army service, Micha traveled in the Far East, where he joined a Himalayan trek with the Israeli NGO Tevel B'Tzedek and volunteered with them in a rural village in Nepal. Back in Israel, Micha began a year dedicated to climate change activism, primarily volunteering with the international movement Extinction Rebellion. He is currently based at the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies in southern Israel, developing a project on how to communicate the reality of climate change to religiously observant Jews. Micha and Ruth.
Thank you, Diana. Hi, Micha.
Hi.
I think that it's not much of a stretch to think about climate change and time. If anything, perhaps time is the great challenge for confronting climate change. Before we start our conversation, I would like to offer a somewhat kind of different angle of how we should think about time and the challenge with climate change. I think that one of the things that we know about the psychology of how we understand time and causality is that in general, we can understand causality when events are contiguous. And so as we saw in Corona time or see in Corona time, people are exposed to some illness, and that exposure to the virus and then getting sick allows us to understand that causality. Sometimes we make mistakes when events are contiguous, like thinking that the rooster crows and that causes the sun to come up. But the challenge in the case of climate change is, how do we really understand that things we do today, human activity is going to have a causal impact on things that happen in the future? And I think that, especially for someone who is a climate activist, perhaps that's one of the greatest challenges to getting people to really engage with climate change, because of that, the challenge of time. Micha, I want to turn to you now, because I know as someone who's very involved with these issues, the work in climate change very much focuses on the present versus the future, the impact so far of climate change, where are we now, the distinction between how we have to adapt now versus mitigation. So I'd like you maybe to just address first the issue of how people think of adaptation. Is it too late already? Have things gone too far already with climate change that we can't adapt? Maybe start there and talking about time and climate change.
Right, so thank you. And also, again, thank you, Diana, for putting this whole thing together. It's really exciting to be here and exciting to have this stage here. So yeah, I mean, when talking about climate change with present versus future, you know, it's talking about adaptation right now and mitigation in the future. And the easiest thing to do is to just wait for the next thing to come up and say, okay, well, when the problem arises, we'll adapt to the new reality and we'll adapt to what we need to do. And also a big question is, what is more important? Should we be investing more time and thought in adaptation and more resources in adaptation? Or should we be talking about mitigating climate change? Because we're talking about, okay, first of all, it's important to understand climate change is already the reality that we are living in. Climate change tends to be thought of and spoken about as a future distant issue, whether we're talking about the distance of 10 years or the distance of 30 years or the distance of 100 years, and future generations is, you know, a big recurring catchphrase, like, you know, we have to do this for future generations, stop burning fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera. But that ship already, to say we need to make sure that we don't reach climate change, that ship has already sailed. We already have climate change locked in. And just to put that in reference, children born in these years, children born in this decade, will not, no matter what we end up doing as a global society, children will not know a climate change-free world. That is a fact. The question is, when we talk about mitigation and adaptation, the question is, are we going to leave the climate change world within the realm of our manageability? Because right now, it's a reality, whether we like it or not. The question is it going to stay this way and get dramatically worse in the future? That's the way we need to be thinking about it. And I won't sugarcoat it and say that every adaptation technique is also good for adaptation and also good for mitigation, because some things are going to need to happen to adapt to climate change that don't have any benefit in the fight for future generations, such as building seawalls and that kind of stuff that needs to happen to protect people. But a lot of the things that we can be doing right now in the present to mitigate climate change for future generations will also have immediate impacts that will mitigate it for the future, will also have positive impacts in the present. Like an easy example I can give is, for example, is planting trees in urban areas and all around the world and stopping deforestation. I mean, trees sequester carbon, which is in the air, and we need it to be sequestered to stay within the manageability of climate change. However, when we also have trees, we're also cooling down urban hot centers. I mean, we have this last week as a prequel to what could conceivably be our and our future generations' lives. And trees actively cool down cities. When we talk about superstorms and sporadic, unreliable hydrological cycles, one of the biggest problems is that we have completely carpeted our human environment with asphalt, and we have taken down trees that actively suck up water and hold ground together. And that's just an example of something that we can be doing right now, planting trees that also cools down cities, which it also makes us more resilient to natural weather fluctuations, and it actively mitigates climate change because it's sucking carbon dioxide out of the air and helping us with our battle to mitigate climate change. I mean, there are lots of other examples, and another excellent example is when we're talking about renewable energy. I mean, the world that we are trying to mitigate is a world with a deteriorating foundation where conflict and geopolitical realities could change. So when you have renewable, localized energies that each country is self-sufficient, or very immediate vicinity countries are self-sufficient with solar and wind and hydroelectricity, etc., they're no longer dependent on the geopolitical realities that are going to change. So you're also making local you're also making countries more resilient on a local level to the changes that are going to be in the past, and you're actively working on solving the problem because we are distancing ourselves from fossil fuels, which are the problem, right? Which are the main problem.
So, Micha, let me ask you, as possibly of the 100 people who are here, you might be the only self-defined activist in the group. What does that mean for you when you think about how you spend your time, how you prioritize time? Tell me what you think, you know, as someone who's passionate about this, who defines himself as an activist, what's the best use of your time?
So that's the $1 million question. And I wish I had, I can give you my answer now, but I wish I had a consistent answer that builds confidence over time. Look, what is the best thing that we can be doing to address the issue within the very, very narrow time frame that the global scientific community has given us? That's a hard question. And, you know, a lot of activists in this, in these last few years that, you know, it's really, you know, Greta Thunberg is like, you know, the face of the activism, but climate activism has come from young people that are like looking at the world that we are expecting and saying, wait, this is insurmountable. How are we going to solve this issue? So when thinking, how could I be most influential? How can we be most influential? The conventional answer that I was also given by many people, and I also flirt with sometimes, is just try and go with the conventional path. I mean, right now, I mean, I haven't gone to university yet. So, you know, you should go to university, either study environmental sciences or public policy, and, you know, build yourself up, start building a career. Maybe you can go into environmental law, et cetera, and then over time you'll have this traction that will make you that will make us be able to legislatively or through policy change certain realities. But when you look at the time frame of that schedule of how can I be influential, it basically doesn't add up, because if science is telling us that we need to make dramatic cuts and dramatic changes within the next 8 or 9 years, then it doesn't add up, that time frame. And the way I see activism, and the reason I placed myself in this position, is because I see activism as sort of a like a loophole, like a time portal, as in a way to frontally address the issue without needing all the momentum that was built up over years. And I think that's because I think that's the fastest thing that we can do, being part of a mass movement that is actively engaging with politicians and decision makers and policy makers from above, while trying to boil the public opinion from below, and have people understand the issue and care about the issue and demand that the issue be addressed, is, in my opinion, the most effective way that I can be using my time. And maybe you can ask me in half a year and I'll have a different answer.
I'm glad that half a year is your time frame, so that I do need to pick up though on your saying you don't necessarily think that the best use of your time may be getting a degree in environmental sciences, but I think that naturally leads to questions about how you deal with the climate deniers. What do you do in a situation where policy is being made by people who don't accept the science? And how do you, in what you're doing, how do you cope with that given that on the one hand, there seems to be a scientific consensus, but we know from the tobacco industry, we know from many historical examples that that doesn't always lead to driving the policy. So what's for yourself in terms of the time investment and what you do with your own time, but also as an activist, how do you cope with the deniers?
How do you cope with deniers? Well, look, first of all, it's important to understand the history of scientific denialism and climate change denialism and the enormous campaigns that went on for 50 or more years, denying the connections between tobacco smoke and cancer. I mean, there is a huge industry really well documented by Naomi Oreskes in her book. She has a book called The Merchants of Doubt. And it basically talks about the whole industry and the whole academic institutions that dedicated themselves towards this denialism. And two things that these institutions did was they manipulated time in scientific data through time in two ways. First of all, because there isn't that immediate cause and effect the same way that you have with the coronavirus. I mean, the coronavirus is, and I don't want to downplay the suffering in any way, but the coronavirus is borderline insignificant with the magnitude of the problems that we're going to need to deal with by the end of the century if climate change isn't addressed properly. And the reason that the whole world basically is shut down and countries are shut down and global travel and commerce has shut down is because there is an immediate cause and effect that people understand. And that immediacy is what enabled people to act. With climate change, there's this long-term boring changes. There's this illusion that, you know, you can put off decision-making to the dakat ishim, you say in Hebrew, like to the last second. You know, there's like a famous quote that a scientist came in the 1970s to American policymakers and told them, like, you know, hey, listen, this is an issue. We need to deal with this. Like, what do we need to do within the next 50 years? The climate could change by 2 degrees. And they said, come back in 45 years and we'll talk about it. So first of all, that the ability to erode the connection between the burning of fossil fuels and the way we practice our industry and climate change, that time frame was used to instill doubt and to procrastinate action. And also it was used in like a very, very disingenuous way to say we need to do more study so that we can understand the problem in a more comprehensive way. So on the one hand, absolutely more study to understand the problems that we are dealing with is absolutely important. But the way they used time there, saying we need to spend more time to do more study so that we can make smarter decisions later, was a disingenuous manipulation of what needed to be done and what still needs to be done today. And today, we don't need more scientific data or study to know that we need to do something. It's no longer a debate. The only debate is, will we be able to do it in time? And that's a question of will.
From people that you meet in what you're doing now, are you optimistic that public opinion can be changed and policy can be influenced? You hear about climate change activists, burnout and climate grief, and people being very depressed that things aren't moving. What's your own sense from the people you meet?
Yeah, burnout is a huge thing. And I mean, climate grief is a new symptom that is is something that's been recognized as a clinical problem, that people are going into depression because of this seemingly insurmountable mountain of climate change that needs to be addressed, and seemingly nobody is addressing properly. And am I optimistic? First of all, I am optimistic because the world is definitely in a state of waking up. The Green New Deal in the United States that was put forth is a very, it's not good enough. It's very important to say it's not good enough. It doesn't align itself with what scientists say need to happen. But the Green New Deal is a huge step forward in climate policy. Europe now announced a few weeks ago that it's going to implement a $1.2 trillion recovery plan for the European economy that is based on sustainable development and on green renewable energies. And if there's any sign for optimism, I think it's that more and more people are understanding that when facing climate change, the answer is not to switch your light bulb, because we have been fed this answer of what can I do, which is an important question to ask. What can I do? It's an important question to ask, and we should have also good answers for those questions. But more and more people are understanding that switching your light bulb won't make a dent in the future of Florida, Miami, and the Middle East. You know, recycling your plastic bottle, even though it is important, won't make a dent in the reality, and no individual action without it being done on a massive scale and without the infrastructure of our economy that is based on fossil fuels, changing that it's based on fossil fuels, without that changing, then we're eluding ourselves that we are making a difference. And more people are understanding that what is needed is not only better recycling systems and maybe a canvas bag at the supermarket, which is important and good and addresses other issues, but what is needed is deep systemic change and deep systemic rethinking of how we do things.
Well, the two countries I think we know best, or at least some of us, Israel and the United States, are not exactly the gold standard here. Is where should we be looking for best practices?
Well, the first answer, and it's a little bit like it's a little bit indirectly answering your question, is the best answer I can give is we should be looking at science. We should be looking at what science is saying. We shouldn't be copycatting other.
That's my favorite answer.
We shouldn't be looking. We shouldn't be copycatting and trying to mimic the way other countries address the problem, because addressing the way other countries address the problem is an insufficient response. And because even the most progressive climate policies in the world that right now can be seen in places like New Zealand, for example, that has, I think, arguably one of the best climate plans right now to decarbonize their economy within the next 25 years, even their plan is not good enough. And there are 5 big pillars that I'll take that back for a second. There are blueprints of exactly what needs to be done and what is possible with the resources and the technology that we have today. A roadmap to decarbonize human civilization, basically, because it's misleading to say we need to decarbonize our energy sector, because our energy sector is just one of the problems. And each one of them have like, different ratios of like, we need to do this to agriculture, we need to do this to energy, we need to do this with transportation, we need to we need to work on actively restoring our ecosystem and to stop deforesting. So they all have some ratio of those answers. But each one of them is a roadmap to align the way the actions we choose with what climate change scientists say needs to happen. And the right way to work about it is to see what needs to happen. Let's look at what this goal is that we need to do. And just to put it in reference, the goal is to keep the climate within our manageability so that we won't inherit the problem to future generations. Because right now, if we stop everything, theoretically, we're there. We can still, the problem is solved for future generations. And we need to work back from what the scientists are saying and draw our actions from there. So the most progressive countries are New Zealand and Bhutan, actually, a country in Asia. But what we need to be doing is looking at the detailed blueprints of how to get out of this mess that we've put ourselves into.
Okay, I think that's about our time. Thanks.
Thank
you, Diana.
Thank you, Ruth and Meah. That was extraordinary. While you were talking, I got on our private chats, my son Jacob, who's, as I said at the beginning, who is producing this event, sent me a quotation from Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, and in which there are extraordinary overlaps with what you were saying, Meah, and I want to read the part that Jacob sent me. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. I had also hoped that the white moderate would reject the myth concerning time in relation to the struggle for freedom. I have just received a letter from a white brother in Texas. He writes, "All Christians know that the colored people will receive equal rights eventually, but it's possible that you're in too great a religious hurry. It's taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth. Such an attitude stems from a tragic misconception of time, from the strangely irrational notion that there is something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of good people. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively, in the knowledge that time is always right to do right. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. And I really feel we could have, well, that's why Jacob sent it. Could just, so much of what Meah said was really, repeating and in a very, very powerful way the message of Martin Luther King. So thank you, Ruth, and
thank you very much.
Thank you.
So our next session is Timekeepers. Welcome to session 5 of Jerusalem Time, a 7-part exploration of time in Jerusalem and beyond at the time of Corona. This symposium is taking place under the umbrella of Jerusalem Tolerance's Yom Yerushalmim, promoting diversity in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day, which began tonight and every day. In this session, Timekeepers, Chaim Milakovsky will be in conversation with Isidorus Katsos about time in ancient texts and contemporary orthodoxies. Chaim Milakovsky received his PhD from Yale and is Professor Emeritus in the Talmud Department at Bar Ilan University, Israel, where he taught from 1977 until last year. He's held visiting professorships at Yale, the University of Maryland, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and the Bernard Revel Graduate School in Jewish Studies, Yeshiva University, as well as a visiting fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford. Chaim is the author of a 2-volume introduction to and commentary on Seder Olam, a unique rabbinic chronology of biblical events. Father Isidorus Charalampos Katsos is an ordained priest of the Orthodox Church of Greece and is spending the year with the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre at the Greek Patriarchate in Jerusalem's Old City. He finished his first PhD in international human rights law at the Freie Universität Berlin and his second PhD at Cambridge University under the supervision of Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. This year, Father Isidorus is a visiting fellow at Hebrew University. His research interests are light, creation, and the theology of human rights.
Thank you very much, Diana. I assume I haven't seen Isidorus in the pictures, but I assume that he is here with us also. Isidorus, how are you? Okay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful, wonderful.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. Isidorus and I have a lot of things in common. And one of the things that we have in common is the connection in a certain sense between our academic life and our religious life. And we're going to see if we have time to talk about both our academic interests and about our religious life. And giving that as a kind of a little bit of a touchstone of what we're going to talk about, which doesn't say too much, I'm going to give Isidorus the honor of asking the first question.
Thank you so much, Chaim. And thank you, Diana, for inviting me to this amazing conference on this so special day. Chaim, I mean, as Diana already mentioned, you have spent a great deal of time working on Seder Olam, which is a rabbinic composition dealing with chronology. Therefore, I would like to ask you to give us some insights about the nature of counting time in the Jewish tradition and how that connects to Jewish thought.
Thank you for that question, which in a certain sense, I guess I was expecting. And I'm gonna touch base here with Julian, which I just realized I was thinking about in terms of, I would say that, you know, Julian has many concerns, but one of his main points was really that there are all these disparate times in Jerusalem, all the disparate ways of counting times. And it's very interesting when we look at ancient history, what's the relationship of what's going on in ancient times and what's going on in counting time today. For example, in chronology, we have, of course, the Jewish era of creation, which many religious Jews will even put that on their checks because I don't want to use any other system of dating. We have, of course, the Christian era, which today is used, of course, Anno Domini, the years of our Lord. and we have the Muslim from the Hijra. We have the Muslim also dating system. In other words, we have today 3 different dating systems which are completely connected to religious traditions. It's fascinating. Without getting into calendar at all, this is also true for calendar, but even in terms of how we count years, how we do the chronology from one time to another. If we go back to the 1st century CE, or 1st century BCE, or any time around then, quite a range of hundreds of years, there was no such thing. In those years, in the olden times, everybody used the same system. Everybody in a city would basically use the same system. In other words, we have the system which was used during the era of the Roman emperors was counting by the emperors. Hundreds of years earlier, there was first that began counting by the Seleucid kings, and afterwards there became something called the Seleucid era, which really lasted in the land of Israel only for about 100 or so years, and then it wasn't already used after the Mered Hashmonaim, after the Maccabees rebelled against the Seleucids. They stopped using that system of counting, but it was based upon whoever was politically in control. That's the way you counted the years. There was no such thing as a specific religious tradition. The Jews, it seems, did not begin to use the years of creation until about 700 CE. And in fact, there is a theory around, which can't be proven or disproven, but I happen to think it's true, that it was the Christians that first used the creation era. And then by 900 to 1000, the Christians started using the Christian era from the birth of Jesus, but the Jews kept on using the creation, their own creation, which was very, very different than the Christian one, because the numbers in the Christian Bible, the Septuagint, the numbers from Abraham, from Adam to Noah, and from Noah to Abraham are different in the Septuagint than they are in the Hebrew text. So it was a very different chronology, and the two religious traditions couldn't get together, even if they had the same era based upon the creation. But it was, now, it's just one little indication of how what one thinks is something almost given in time. The time is so important for religious tradition, but when we go back 2,000 years, we see that there was nothing like that. It was simply based upon secular political power, which is also a fascinating question. Why should the counting of time be dependent upon that? And the answer to that is, of course, very obvious, because secular political power wants to control everything about and doesn't want any sources of coalition of forces which they aren't in control of. So right away, as soon as you start thinking and talking about chronology, you see there's so many things which are so relevant. So I'm just going to mention some things that I'm not going to talk about. You know, the question of history versus memory, the question of history, factual history versus stories that you tell. These are all things that these are things that are all going back, which are so relevant to our lives today and how the study of chronology can help you. And I'm going to stop right here.
Can I step in?
No, because I want to ask you now. I've talked a lot about my academic thing. I don't want you to react, because maybe we'll come back to it later, but I want to make sure that we both have a chance to talk about our different things. And since, as Diana said in the introduction, she said that you work on creation and light. And I know that there is a relationship between creation and light and time. And I would want you to expound why is time related to creation and light? What is the relationship between them? Please, Isidoros, inform us.
Thank you so much, Jaime. It's a fascinating question. I've been working on the nature of light for many years, in a body of literature which comments on Genesis 1. It is a Greek tradition. It starts with Philo of Alexandria, which is who is a pivotal figure between Hellenistic Judaism and early Christianity. And then at least we assume there has been a longer tradition, but the first writings that we have about these commentaries start with Philo, and then they continue in the Christian tradition. What is fascinating to me is that light is intrinsically related to time, not only in the Greek patristic tradition and the commentaries on Genesis, but also in Greek thought in general. But let me focus on the Greek patristic tradition. The idea is that the world is created, that time is created with the world, and we'll say cum tempore. And this is an important point because there are so many debates between Greek philosophers of the time as to whether the world is created in time, there's a beginning in time, or whether the world is eternally existing so that there is no beginning in time. This is a very important debate in late antique sources. The Christians want to emphasize that at least in some level, creation starts with the beginning of time, or time begins with creation. However, how can we sense time? How do we measure time? How do we feel? Where do we find time? And the answer to that is that in order to be able to observe time, we need some kind of change, some kind of motion. And the first motion or change that there is in the universe, as it is narrated in Moses' Genesis narrative, cosmogenesis, is with light, because light is the first change, is a change from darkness to illumination. But that is not enough, because you only have one change and you need a second comparison in order to start counting the passing of time. And that is where the change between the first day and the first night comes in, the first evening and the first morning comes in. So the transition from the first evening to the first morning is the beginning of counting time, because the way we observe the universe through the motion of the heavenly stars. That comes in Genesis 1:14, where the stars are signs and the sun and the moon are there as signs for the seasons. So counting time and counting the change of time during the year is related to the observance of the heavenly stars and the motions of the heavenly bodies, which of course are bodies of light. So there you see, not just in the very moment of creation coming to be, the world coming to be, but also the world as it is and as it functions. Light and the change from light to darkness is our guide into how to keep time, how to measure time naturally, the most natural way of relating to time.
If I could just interject a question here for a second. What you're saying makes, of course, tremendous sense, but it seems that isn't this, in a certain sense, a very instrumentalist way of looking at the relationship between time and light? In other words, you emphasize the fact that without night and day, you can't have the passing of time. But is there something kind of on a more basic element? In other words, if I'm trying to verbalize what I'm kind of thinking here, if we see light as something which expresses something of coming out of God, darkness is a lack of God's immanence into the world, and light is somehow that presence. I think that's both a Jewish and a Christian concept. So does time relate to that divine spark, that divine? You see what I'm saying? In other words, what I was getting from you now is just a sense of, well, physically in our world, we can't measure time without the change of light. Therefore, that's why time is also related to creation. But is there something, in a sense, in a more, to use essentially, something more at the moment of creation, when light came out from him, from God, did time come out in some sense also?
I mean, it is not clear whether time is a condition like space or extensionality, something that exists already, is in the DNA of creation, and it's only the unfolding of time that comes out together with light, or whether it is light, whether it is time itself. So I cannot answer that because it could be answered both ways. But what is fascinating in your question, I think, and it is spot on, it's not just, I mean, counting time is a mechanical process. It's not, it doesn't require lots of, any reflection, any philosophical, theological reflection. But the notion of time itself, of course, requires that. And it seems to me that the idea behind it is that being and existence is intrinsically related to time through the notion of life. Once you have life, once you have an organic whole, you need to, I mean, time is intrinsic to that. And what we experience as the unfolding of time is only one way of observing a living organism. So that creation, in a way, is a living organism, and it is not a kind of dead scientific template which we can deconstruct and reconstruct according to certain mathematical formulas. Behind all that, there is something which is imbued with life, which is, of course, the Spirit of God. And that is where time comes in, as I think, as the notion of life intrinsically related to being. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. I would have, I mean, we don't want to get too philosophical here. I would love to see some kind of analysis at some time. Perhaps we'll talk about it ourselves, about how some kind of philosophical reflections about time will bring us to the sense of God's Spirit and light. But I want to move on now, because I want to talk, as I said, we want to talk about two things, and I have some questions which you're going to have to help me on, because, and I'm sure many of us out here, we know that the Greek tradition has a huge emphasis upon liturgy, much more than the way the Western tradition developed over the last millennium, let's say. Obviously, the Western tradition has many parts to it. There's the monastic tradition, the Western tradition also, which has some parts of it have tremendous liturgy, but the Greek, it's very much, not the Greek only, but the whole entire Orthodox tradition. I understand that's true. I also know, and it was mentioned in our conversations different times, this idea of the eighth day. And I would like you to fill us in both about the nature of sanctification of time through liturgy, and the notion of the sanctification of time through the eighth day, through Sunday, and where these come from. Do you see them as biblical? Do you see them as church ideas? Obviously, we can't separate the two of them completely. Please, Isidoros.
Thank you, Chaim. I mean, if you ask an Orthodox about time and liturgy, the first and last thing that comes to mind is the notion of liturgical time, as we call it. Take it as a state, as a term. Take it as a special term, which I will try to unpack in a few thoughts. But relating it to your previous question, the basic definitions of time coming from philosophy is that of Plato, who thinks of time as we experience it, as a moving image of eternity. So we have the notion of eternity and of motion and change. And Aristotle comes in and develops the latter sense, where he defines time as a number of change with respect to before and after. And this is this is the notion of historical time. Now, why I mention that is because we here see two notions of time. I mean, the extensionality in time as a progress, which we can count as a before and after, past, present, and future. And there is a circular notion of time and identity, something that is already there, which is represented as a circle and circularity. Now, the whole liturgical time of the Orthodox tradition is characterized by these two schemes, figures, circularity and progress, extensionality. So we have a basic pattern of a worshiping pattern, which is connected to time, and you see it extended through the day through the week, through the year cycle, through the many years, so that you have, if you like, a center and many homocentric circles of counting time, which is in a way kind of expanding the same idea. Now, the idea, all of time, focuses around the event of resurrection, which is what we worship on a Sunday, the resurrected Christ. And this is, of course, also the culmination point of the whole Passion narrative. So you have a Holy Week and a worshiping 7th or 8th day, if you like, because Sunday is the first day after the Sabbath, and also the 8th day. So you have a pattern of 7 days and Sunday. You have a pattern of 7 Lent weeks and Easter. You have a pattern of 7 weeks after Easter and Pentecost. And you have the same pattern repeated in every feast, for example, in Christmas or in every other major feast. So there is this pattern of 7 days and 1 worshiping particular day, which is connected to the resurrection of Christ. So 6 laboring days, or 7 days of labor, and then 1 day of worshiping of rest and resurrection. Within the daily circle as well, you have a pattern of 7 praying times. From Vesper, when the sun sets, again, the connection with light, and which is a veneration of the creation with Psalm 118, 19, is it? And also culminating in the not veneration, but in praising God for the gentle light that he gives us, to the liturgy, which happens right after the sun has risen. And at the time of sunrise, we have this Gloria hymn to celebrate the light that is given to us by God. So there is a pattern, a rhythm of interchange of darkness and day, darkness and light within 24 hours, within 7 days a week, within 12 months in a year. And that is the kind of liturgical pattern around which the worshiping community gathers around throughout the year, but also particularly on a Sunday.
Can I just ask one very specific kind of by the side question, not that much focused on the, does every in monastic Greek communities, will all the monks, priest monks or just monks, will they all take part in all of these services, or is it assigned different? I'm just curious how this works, and I just want to take that. Is the time personal or community? Let me put the question that way.
It is expected that everyone will participate in the communal services as long as they... So
it's as personal, both personal and community time.
Yes, as long as they do not have other things to do for the community or for the worshiping, for worshiping practices. So everyone is expected to participate, but there are apologies accepted. Yeah. The reason being that this rhythmical pattern, circularity, repetition, progress, extension, kind of creates a rhythm so that the worshiping life becomes a pattern of life, a way of life, if you like. So that worshiping community is a community with a certain way of life, centered around a certain meaning of light and time, so that it transforms and informs and transforms the worshiping participant. But I think now I have to reverse the question and bring you back into game and ask you, as a practitioner Jew, what would you say is so distinctive about time? And me, as an Orthodox, I would very much like to know if you can make a brief, not comparison, but reflection on the Shabbat and the Sunday, and whether what I mentioned about, the liturgical cycle focusing around Sunday and resurrection, whether there is a kind of correspondence with the Shabbat, or whether the Shabbat has an entirely different meaning. And I would be very interested in that.
Well, here we're going back to another early talk, Josh and Moshe, that they spoke about Shabbat in the yeshiva, both of them about their own experiences and how they experience it. Shabbat, it's fascinating because Shabbat, Josh was opposed to calling it a day of rest, but I'll still still call it the day of rest. And of course, it's based upon God's rest, which we all, I assume everybody here knows that. And I find fascinating the connection, which I'm learning from you, that every Sunday celebrates the resurrection. In other words, of course, I knew that Christianity did not follow the Jewish Sabbath, the Jewish Saturday, other than some very tiny sects, etc. But I find so we're right away going to be at an impossible place to really come together, because there's no way in the world that, of course, resurrection could have any religious meaning. We can relate to your relationship to it, but we can't relate to it ourselves, of course. And we respect very much your relationship, but it's not a notion that can have. Now,
just tiny bracket, sorry to interrupt. Let me just say, without developing it, that resurrection is connected to eschatology and eschatological time. So would eschatology be
yes,
okay.
That there we have. Okay, that is beautiful. That's a great beginner, because there is this classical notion which many streams in Christianity took over from Judaism, and that is the 6,000 years of the world, and then the 7th year of the millennium, which is of course the millennial age, and all these ideas of which so many Christian, both Orthodox and Latin theologians put a lot of energy in trying to determine, and Jews also, when exactly this would be and how it would work out. But the idea was in many, it's not that strong in our own day, though I'm trying to bring it back a little bit in some of my writings, even academic writings. But the idea is that this is something that the Sabbath, therefore, in that sense, very much is a sacred day, which stands for, in the same way that the 7,000th year will be God's year, or God's day in a sense, because a day for, as Psalm says, a day for God is 1,000 years for man. So this interrelationship of the years and the days. So Sabbath, Shabbat, very much has this idea of being a day that you are, in a sense, I don't want to say a realized eschatology, to use that classic Christian term that is sometimes used for the New Testament, but there is a sense that you are leaving the mundane. Here I would really go to the instrumentalist idea that you're leaving the mundane of this world and you're entering a sacred world. And I think those of us who really relate to this in a certain way, even if, as Josh said, he could really go to his office on Shabbat, even if for some reason one day he had to do that, once you have this innate sense that you're on a different plane, then it changes everything else that you're doing also. So to me, that doesn't bother me that much. In other words, when you come to our Shabbat meal, even though that you are a very observant from a specific sense, member of the Christian, of the Greek Orthodox priesthood and brotherhood, the religiosity of it talks to you. So therefore, the religiosity talks to the soul of the person, sometimes even if he's in a place where he doesn't feel that comfortable, things like that. And I think that Shabbat, for me, I really have a sense that there is, it's one of the few of these kind of romantic notions of this special soul that comes to you for Shabbat. And I really, in a sense, feel that, because there's something different about it. As soon as we light candles Friday night, it really seems to be a different reality. So I think that our time is up. I think we made the best use we can of just a half an hour.
We could use 7,000 years of discussions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
we'll
Chaim.
Back to Diana now.
Thank you, Chaim and Isidorus. And it's actually kind of thrilling to see that the interaction between you that I've seen on many occasions at our Shabbat dinner table in Jerusalem, it can be reproduced on Zoom in this way. So thank you, really thank you both. So our next session is called On Calendars and on Time. Actually, I can't help mentioning now that that's, I believe, a quotation from Marilyn Monroe, or part of a quotation, who once said, "I've been on calendars, but I've never been on time." However, she has nothing to do with what we're about to hear. So welcome session of Jerusalem Time, a 7-part exploration of time in Jerusalem and beyond at the time of Corona. This symposium is taking place under the umbrella of Jerusalem Tolerance's Yom Yerushalmim, promoting diversity in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day, which began tonight and every day. In this session on calendars and on time, Abdullah Antepli and Raquel Euclides will talk about how time is made tangible in Islamic tradition. Imam Abdullah Antepli is Associate Professor at Duke Divinity School and the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University, North Carolina. He completed his education and training to be an Imam in his native Turkey and went on to work on a variety of faith-based humanitarian and relief projects in Burma and Malaysia. As the first Muslim chaplain at both Wesleyan and Duke universities, Abdullah founded the Association of College Muslim Chaplains. He is a senior fellow in Jewish-Muslim relations at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Raquel Euclides received her BA from Princeton and her PhD from Harvard in comparative Islamic and Jewish studies. She studied Jewish law in Jerusalem and New York and Islamic law and Arabic in Egypt, Morocco, and the Netherlands. Her publications span medieval Islamic law, comparative Jewish and Islamic traditions, and a monograph on Islam in America post 9/11. Raquel has taught extensively in the US and Israel on Islam and Judaism and Jewish-Muslim relations. Since 2010, she's been the curator of the Islam and Middle East collection at the National Library of Israel, where she oversees development of the collection and leads digital, cultural, and educational initiatives based on the library's Arabic and Islamic cultural heritage.
Thank you so much, Diana. And it's really, to quote a wonderful artist, it's absolutely thrilling to be here. And thank you to all of you who have hung in till 10:30. And I want to thank you, Diana, for the opportunity to reconnect to Imam Abdullah, who is an old friend and who is an extraordinary soul. So let's dive in. Here we are talking about sacred time, and you, Imam Abdullah, are experiencing sacred time right now. You are fasting in that you are 7 hours ahead behind Jerusalem, so it is daytime and you are fasting.
Yes.
And we are at towards the end of the month of Ramadan, and of course the last 10 days of Ramadan are considered to have even greater, more heightened religious intensity. We were just hearing about reflections on sacred time between Orthodox Jewish and Greek Orthodox Christian ways of thinking about the Sabbath and Sunday. What's striking about Ramadan is that you do not step out of your normal life. You do not step away from normal time to enter into a parallel sacred time, the way that Jews will step away from their regular activities to immerse themselves, whether it's in Shabbat or Yom Kippur. But rather, Islamic tradition, in the form of the Sunnah, the normative practice, sets out the idea that a person is supposed to live her or his regular lives while fasting, and that's the work of Ramadan.
Minus eating and drinking, yes.
Minus eating and drinking and smoking. While adding and intensifying religious and moral activities. And in fact, as you wrote to me earlier, just in this day, you have experienced as a working imam during the COVID crisis, the entire cycle of life, right? You said you performed an akika service, which is at the birth of a child, a nikah, which is a wedding, the beginning of a wedding ceremony, and 2 funerals just today. So you're not only not stepping away from life, you are deeply immersed in life while bringing sacredness into it. So if we could start out by your sharing with us, how do you think about sacred time in Islam? And perhaps if you want to reflect comparatively, as you have deep knowledge of the Jewish tradition as well, to do some comparative reflecting for us about Islamic and Jewish notions of sacred time.
Thank you so very much, Raquel. What an exceptionally beautifully articulated question, which points out to the heart of Muslim or Islamic understanding of sacred time. But before that, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Greetings, shalom, and Mazal Tov, or however we celebrate Yom Yerushalayim. I really appreciate 10:30 p.m. in late night, the people sticking with the program and being with us. And as someone who spent a lot of time in Jerusalem or have experienced Yom Yerushalayim, there are many other troubling ways to celebrate this day. I am so glad that through this we can bring so much meaning and so much of that spirit of Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, in that plurality. Semantically, it's a plural word. I think we are bringing that plurality into these conversations, thanks to Diana. I'm really grateful for. First of all, your question really allows me to make this broad generalization, which I think will be accepted by many Muslims. For any practicing Muslim mind, to imagine that there is a difference between sacred and non-sacred in life. There is a space, time that could be secular and religious. Most Muslim mind who believe that sanctity as a broad general category of which spreads every aspect of life, which every aspect of time, which every aspect of what we do, they will have a hard time. When I came to the United States, one of my biggest puzzle in the American society was how sanctity or religious or religiosity is assigned to particular times of the week, and how it's sort of a compartmentalized place where you go and do, and that sacred time or sacred activity or sacred ritual, sometimes from my judgmental eyes maybe, has very little connection to the past time or very little impact on the time to come, unless you go back to that cycle again. So first of all, I would like to resist this idea that sacred time, sacred season, or sacred month is an indication that the rest of the time or rest of the place, rest of our lives is not sacred at all. If anything, Islam considers time and life as a sacred as a whole. And if some of those sacred days or sacred months or sacred rituals, they are considered as the milestones or particular stations which will enhance and enable the believer to make the entire timeline more sacred. The entire time, if I can, I love those car races. You know, those car races go, and then when they run out of fuel and they need to change the tire, they immediately stop, and they quickly sort of invest in that vehicle to make sure that vehicle go back and run again as quickly, as efficiently, as successful as possible. To me, Jummah is that station. To me, Ramadan is that station. The sanctity of Ramadan is very much about evaluating the previous 11 months. Did I live a sacred life? Did I bring up the sacred values in the previous 11 months? And how can I make sure in this lab, in this milestone, in this time, and therefore Muslims do not stop completely like the Jewish tradition or Shabbat tradition. It has to be as close to your regular life, your work life, your professional life, or personal life. It has to be as sort of relevant to that activity, so that when you go back to those regular time, then you will bring the spirit of Ramadan with you. You will bring the spirit of Jummah with you. You will bring the spirit of whatever particular holiday that you have just gone through. So in so many ways, sacred time has a transactional utilitarian value in Islam, which aims or functions effectively to pump sanctity for the rest of your life, for pump sanctity or evaluate the previous sanctity. I want to bring up one beautiful verse of the Holy Quran, 103rd chapter, which really encapsulates this. 103rd chapter is only one line, and it's Imam Shafi'i, one of the sages of our religion, says, if God would have just revealed this one line chapter, pretty much humanity could have figured out the rest. It's like the heart of Islam in his words. It's the Surah Al-Asr, as you know very well, Raquel. Well, Asr innal insan. And every meeting, every religious gathering in the Muslim tradition ends reading and reciting with this chapter, which in my own translation says, by the token of time, God is taking oath on time, reflecting on time. How regretful, how much of a huge and incredible loss to have this time, this life, a wild and precious life, as Mary Oliver say. I think she also understood this. How much of a huge loss to live this life unless you have the faith, unless you try to pack as much goodness, amal salih, the behaviors and actions of good deeds into this life. And unless, it's as important, you do this with a group of people where you promote and suggest perseverance, patience, and resilience to one another. It's not like an individual journey. And I think reflecting Islamic tradition through its sanctity of time, or the Islamic concept of time, is to see how you can make the whole timeline sacred. And by assigning further sanctity into certain milestones and stations, is only there to nourish the entire timeline as sacred, as much packed as good deeds as possible, and also as much it brings the concept of collective. One of my also confusions when I came to the United States was how much of sense of collective wasn't there initially. I come from a very collective thinking society. Like if people would have asked me, what is really the ultimate goal of any religion or Islam, is not to create ethical, moral human being primarily. It's to create ethical, moral societies, ethical, moral groups, collectives. That is, I see this sense of collectivity also very much in the heart of Judaism as well. And I want to ask you about that too. So one aspect of the sanctity of time, the Jummah and the Ramadan, people are now rushing to pack as much as possible, harvest the fruit, the spiritual pleasures and spiritual teachings of Ramadan as much as possible. Because they want this to spill over the next 11 months, because they want to sustain themselves spiritually for the next 11 months with the spirit of Ramadan. But also the sacred times, the sanctity of time in Islam is a way to reenact your memory with that collective, that ummah, that story between you and the Prophet Muhammad, but even before, as Islam imagines itself to be the youngest child of Abrahamic family, as Islam sees itself within the Abrahamic context, in many ways, the sense of time or sacred time is a way to reenact and reactivate the collective memory or collective memory technology to connect on those particular sacred days, what happened on that day, what has been revealed on that day. Like it was really Laylatul Qadr a couple of days ago. So in a way, you go to that memory, but that memory sort of expands that time. You connect with the past and you prepare for the eternal future. I hope that answers the question.
It was beautiful, but I want to pick up on Laylatul Qadr. Imam Abdullah and I had the chance to meet a few nights ago on Zoom for a conversation that you had with Yossi Klein Halevi about God. And I actually want to bring God back into this conversation because I was struck that—
As I said, God never leaves anything. It's always within the whole.
Good. It's not so hard to bring God back. So I was very struck by the way you're describing sacred time until now has been very much focused on the person and the community. And what I have always found interesting about Islamic notions of sacred time is that despite what you laid out so elegantly about Ramadan being this kind of like gearing up and storing up spiritual energy for the whole year, there are throughout the calendar specific times and even specific times of the night that are considered to be more. Like there's a kind of general, and then there are specific nights that the Quran, the Sunnah talks about it being more. And Laylatul Qadr is one of the examples. If you'll all allow me to just take a moment and share a PowerPoint, I'm gonna jump through a few. I'll come back to these guys, but I want to get to.
For those who are in the audience, if you are not familiar with what Raquel is doing in the museum, you are missing so much. I really hope you will connect to her incredible scholarship. And
thank you.
And she is modeling how can you be so proud and connected in your own faith tradition, but can also develop incredible amount of insight, love, scholarship, knowledge on other tradition that doesn't require you compromising from who you are. She's living. She's an exemplary figure in that sense.
Thank you very much. I would say the same thing about you. What we're looking at is one of the joys of my work at the National Library is that I have access to these beautiful Islamic manuscripts that we are now digitizing and making available so everyone will have access to these beautiful manuscripts. We're looking at a 16th century Iranian Quran and the chapter of what's sometimes translated as the night of power, the night of destiny, Laylatul Qadr. This is Surah Al-Qadr.
The night of might, like Yom Kippur.
The night of might is how you would just, okay. So what we're looking at is in the big, the enlarged gold line is Inna anzalnahu bi Laylatul Qadr, right? That there's something that, and indeed we revealed it or we brought it down during this night of might. And it's usually understood as a reference to the Quran, the first revelation of the Quran being revealed on this night. And then the Quran chapter goes on and says, the night of, we revealed it on the night of might. What will convey until thee what the night of might is. The night of might is better than 1,000 months, right? Why? The angels and the spirit descend therein. This is an example of the exception of the case where the Quran is taking a particular time and dedicating it to being something that is special. Now, so my second question to you, I'll stop sharing for a second. My question to you is, how do you understand what happens on these kinds of nights? And in my own research, I work on Muslim devotional practices, and throughout the calendar, there's a really interesting tension between, on the one hand, this lack of specificity and the beautiful way you described it, but also throughout the calendar, there are these moments where from an outsider's perspective, it almost looks like the gap between God and humanity gets bent closer.
Absolutely.
In the space-time continuum, there's like a bending that happens so that human beings seem to have greater access. What do you think about that? How would you understand Laylatul Qadr? We talked about there are numerous times throughout the year. The Prophet Muhammad talked about the last third of the night being the most powerful for prayer. Help us understand the particularity of certain times, given what you said earlier.
Just to recap this beautiful question again, I hope we will have many of those in the future. Yes, every time is sacred. Yes, God pays attention to and hears your questions and prayers at any time. But also here is the ambivalence of the divine. In the Quran says, but there is one particular night. There is one particular moment in that night where I reveal the Quran, that in that time, God rewards thousands of times more. God pays particular attention. God immediately rewards multiple times than other times, etc., which seems to be in the surface contradiction. But at the same time, God says, I will never reveal that exact time. When is Laylatul Qadr? I won't. I will give some hints. There will be some extraordinary climate changes or seasonal changes. Maybe it's in Ramadan, maybe it's not, maybe in the odd days of Ramadan, maybe. Like there is an interestingly beautiful divine dance, musical, melodic dance, saying, not specifically giving Sunday 6:45 p.m. or December 27th on this, etc., so that you will always long for that time. So within that 365 days, you will try to catch that jackpot moment where you will get it all, where all your sins are forgiven. But human beings are human beings. Muslims maybe partially trying to cheat it by forcing God's hand or some of the indicators and trying to find that exact zip code so they can actually cast their net and catch the Laylatul Qadr. But also, I think the secondly, less mischievous interpretation is Muslims are, through the practices of Laylatul Qadr or Ramadan, they are doing rehearsals. Because when that moment comes, when you feel in your lifetime, you actually catch that Laylatul Qadr, that moment of might, power, you need to be prepared. You need to practice. You need to do a rehearsal. So in a way, the Ramadan activities, the exact particular time of that Laylatul Qadr is not known. It goes back to what I just said in the beginning. It has a utilitarian, it has a transactional value to prepare the believer. When that moment happens, it will exactly prepare you. You will be ready to capture the spiritual moment. I also would like to hear from you. I'm sorry, I talked a lot more.
That's great.
The Jewish concept of time, which is incredibly unique, that especially in the concept of Shabbat, it was wonderful to hear Father Isidoros and the Chaim earlier, why Judaism feels in that particular 25 hours, it has to be different, heavenly. There should be difference between that particular 25 hours and the rest of the week, that you have to stop your life. It has to, in a way, almost you have to create an artificial lab environment to work on yourself. Where is that expectation is coming from? Or through that, what is the Jewish concept of time?
I think that I have a few different thoughts. I don't know if they align, but I will share a few different ways of getting at your question. The first is the idea of Shabbat is very deeply embedded into the basic architecture of Judaism, right? As you had said in one of our earlier conversations, it's one of the first. It's one of the first ideas. The notion of human beings emulating God in this world, in our capacity to create and our capacity to step back. So Shabbat starts with the basic God-human relationship that we are connected. And then, for the way I understand Shabbat, you think about, the great thinkers like Franz Rosenzweig or others who have talked about Shabbat, where Shabbat is a way of entering into cosmic time, where through the 3 meals of Shabbat, we go through creation, revelation, redemption. And so, we talked earlier about Laylatul Qadr, where we talked about bending the space-time continuum and the idea that you can somehow, even though God in Islam, and this is something, you had used the words a few days ago about holy envy, and I have a holy envy of the very stark, very exalted notion of God in Islam, where God is Laisa kamithlihi shay'an, right? God is very much exalted. Allah Ta'ala right?
Mm-hmm.
But also Islam finds many different ways to bend that arc, right? To get the human being very close to God. So in Judaism, in a funny way, I think that human beings have a lot more chutzpah in Judaism, where we feel much more empowered about from the outset about a God-human being relationship. We're partnering with God in creation, and then we take, we step back, like God was able to step back. And then Shabbat is this opportunity to rethink all of cosmic human history, which I do feel has echoes. It looks very different, has what I would call an Islamic twist on how we incorporate history into our lives. Jewish holidays, of course, are a lot about recreation and reenactments. And then I think about the perennial Islamic time after you go through Ramadan, you have a 2-month breather, and then you enter into the Hajj season, which is round 2 of sacred time. And sacred time for the Hajj is tapping back into a kind of Islamic cosmic history of reenacting the Abraham, Ismail, Hagar relationship, which is the archetypal relationship, yes. Right? And so I see, even though Shabbat looks very different from Ramadan, or Jewish holidays look very different from Islamic holidays, I do feel like you can see common threads and common themes.
Especially common goals as well. I think through some distinct and unique strategies, it is to make everything holy, not to keep holiness or sanctity between the 4 walls of the houses of worship, or between the numbered days of our high holidays or Ramadan. The ultimate goal is to reenact the innate sanctity and holiness in our souls, that every time, every place, every aspect of our life will be holy and sacred, inshallah.
Allah. So thank you very much. We can go on for a while, as the others have said, but given that the hour is late, let's turn it back to Diana. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. It's an incredible opportunity, and it gave me a lot of clarity. I have millions of questions. In a way, I wonder if Jews, Christians, and Muslims and others, we can see our holy times as a pointer, not get lost in that holy time, but look what it's pointing out to. As Rumi said, I said it in our earlier call, Rumi says, I'm pointing out the sun, but the fools are getting lost in my finger. They are not seeing the bigger reality that's being called, and that's what holiness is about. And I think you are creating that holiness here. Thank you so much.
Raquel and Abdullah, really, it was extraordinary to hear everything you said, your incredible learning and wisdom, both learning and wisdom, 2 very different things, which both of you really exemplified, and your relationship with each other and your interaction with what other people said. And it's just, it's really a privilege to have heard you. Thank you
very much. And if I may say one last thing, this is an opportunity to speak to a lot of friends in Jerusalem. You are surrounded by many wonderful Muslim friends, I hope. The Saturday is the last day of Ramadan. Sunday is Eid. This is a good time to check your Muslim neighbor, Muslim friends. Tap into the joy, spiritual joy that they have been accumulating for the last month, and be in conversation and share that joy, spiritual joy, with them.
Thank you, Abdullah.
Eid Sa'id and Kul Am wa Antum Bikhair.
Allah yarda alayk and Eid Mubarak. Thank you so much.
So I've put everything on script for myself, because I was very scared about us all going overtime. You know, academics, it's a very common thing. And
there was no pay for overtime. We weren't going to do that.
There was no pay, right. Meryl put it.
Yeah.
But so I scripted everything for myself. And I'm going to end with my script. But before that, I just want to say that this is the 3rd year, I think, that I've organized something for Yom Yerushalayim under the umbrella, as I said, of Yom Yerushalmim. And the other things have been live in Jerusalem, in our apartment, or on the street outside, or something like that. And this year was kind of challenging to think at first, what would I do instead? And I committed myself to, over Pesach, I'll come up with an idea. And I came up with this idea, and kind of fully formed in my mind, I also came up with who I would love to speak and the general topics I would like them to address. And there was a kind of vision of what it could be like, but it has so far exceeded what I expected, and how beautiful I thought it could be. And as you've been speaking, I've been getting some comments in the private comment box, but also in WhatsApps. And actually, my friend Meah just wrote and said, it's been like a symphony. And I think that is really a very wonderful description of what it's been like to sit and to hear all of you talking in these amazingly different, but also, as we've said, quite overlapping in some cases, meditations and thoughts about time. So now I'm going on script. Time's up. But before we put out the lights, please join me in a silent hand clap to thank our amazing speakers, Julian Barnett, Moshe Halbertal, Josh Schoenfeld, Toby Pearl-Freilich, Muriel Lederman-Euclides, Chaim Milakovsky, Isidorus Katsos, Ruth Austrian, Micha Price, Abdullah Entepli, Raquel Euclides, Lynn Kay, and Simon Goldhill. Also, a huge thanks to my son, Jacob Lipton, for producing this event really magnificently. And last but not least, to thank Jerusalem Tolerance team, especially Tal Alafi, for encouraging me and inspiring me to organize this and helping to promote it. We'll close the symposium with a 5-minute solo performance for female voice of Brief Reflection on Accuracy, a poem by Miroslav Holub. It's not about Jerusalem, but it is about an unsettled cooperation generated by time in an unnamed city. The setting we'll hear is the first of a 3-part piece composed by Andrew Lovett of Princeton University for the memorial service of my late husband, Peter Lipton, which took place at King's College, Cambridge in November 2008. The wonderful singer is Olivia Ray.
Accurately know where to move and when, and likewise birds have an accurate built-in time sense and orientation. Humanity, however, lacking such instincts, resorts to scientific research. Its nature is illustrated by the following occurrence. A certain soldier had to fire a cannon at 6 o'clock sharp every evening. Being a soldier, he did so. When his accuracy was investigated, he explained, at 17:59 precisely, I step up to the cannon, and at 18 hours sharp, I fire. And it was clear that this method of firing was absolutely accurate. All that was left was to check that chronometer. So the clockmaker down in the city was questioned about his instrument's accuracy. Said the clockmaker, this is one of the most accurate instruments ever. Just imagine, for many years now, a cannon has been fired at 6 o'clock sharp. And every day I look at this chronometer, and always it shows exactly 6. So much for accuracy and fish move in the water, and from the sky comes a rushing of waves. Chronometers tick and cannons boom.
Really beautiful. She's very